Hello, everybody. Thank you guys so much for waiting. My infinite apologies, but Georgie can't control the traffic, so unfortunately, we'll just have to bear with him. So I appreciate it. How are you, Georgie?
I'm fine. How are you? Sorry
Good.
for being late.
No worries. I altered my mic again, so I'll be keeping my eye on the chat. So please let me know how loud it is. If I need to turn up or whatever, I was kind of moving things around, and I'm not sure I'm at the same volume I was last time, which people told me was the best volume they had heard so far. So just please let me know in the chat, please. Okay, so if you're new, consider subscribing. We're doing live streams every other week on Friday at 6 p.m. PST. All super chats are donated to Mr. Raymond PhD, and we are going to read those at the end of the show. So yeah, I haven't sent my second payment to him of all the super chats, but a week ago I sent him $156, which I'm sure he appreciated. If people in the chat are bugging you, you can block them, but I've instructed the mods and myself, I don't really block. I think I have one person blocked on YouTube, so I'm not going to be doing that in the chat. So you can do it if they're bugging you. And then a frequent thing that seems to be said about these live streams is that people are completely lost. And so if that was accurate and a person was motivated to kind of figure out where we're coming from, you can check the old episodes of the Generative Energy Podcast on this YouTube channel. Or you could go to my Twitter, which I'm constantly posting a stock tweet about resources. And so we could probably talk about this. I wouldn't mind getting into it after we talk about the giveaway. But I think knowing resources or accumulating resources is really the difference between somebody getting to a place of autonomy versus somebody just spinning their wheels and always being confused. But I'm sure you have a lot to say on that, and I want to totally get to it. But let's do the giveaway winners. So let me make this smaller and switch to this. Okay, so people were saying that I was cherry picking the people that I wanted to win. So Georgie, you can't see this, but I have a random YouTube comment picker up. And so Georgie, what were the products that you were so gracious to give the giveaway people?
So I don't know if you want to continue with the talk of it, but I keep getting requests for Energen, Estroban, and Oxidal. So these are three products that people consistently request, and they happen to be fairly benign. They're not steroids if somebody's concerned about taking steroids and things like that. So these three on top of the talk of it. So I think 4 products will be fine, and then if I keep getting requests for more, I'll add more.
Just a minute. So you want to give away four things right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's even more than we were originally. Georgie, it's just very gracious of you. Okay, so I'm going to pick the first winner. I'm not, and everybody can see this. So the first winner is me. Just kidding. Okay, it actually did come up as me, but we're going to. Oh no, I don't want. I clicked the wrong button. Randomly pick winner. Okay, Mr. Jones, Gilbert Ling seems to have a pretty small head, so that's a winning comment. Me again. Okay.
It's not very random, is it?
Eli, the science guy, you are the second winner. Baller Balls, you are the third winner. And 4, Georgie?
Yeah, 4. I mean, let's do 4 and then see the feedback, and if people like it, we can do 4 more. Or if they don't like it, then we scale back.
Okay, just a minute. It looks like I'm a little not as loud here. Okay, and then Jason Nozaj is the 4th winner. Okay, guys, please let me know how it says Georgie's louder. I turned up a little bit. Let me know if that's okay. Okay, so we have 4 winners. Those people need to contact me, Danny at dannyroddy.com, I think is my email. Okay, and I didn't send that to you, so we probably can't talk about it. Okay, do you want to talk about resources a little bit? I think I didn't really plan this, but I think that is something I'm always thinking about, accumulating information that a person thinks is good information and that can help them work out kind of their own problems, over a long period of time.
So, I mean, what do you mean about resource? Us providing resources, or?
Not so much. I guess I spend some time like saying, here's the Repeat wiki, here's my Instagram, here are I don't know, just like accumulate the Repeat Clips YouTube channel, you know.
Right,
So
right.
I think obviously I'm very biased that Repeat is an excellent source of information. So I am divvying out the little parts on the internet that have a lot of information. And I know yourself, we've talked about how I use like Evernote for collecting information. You have I think another method, but I mean, do you have a perspective on how that's helped you learn as an individual?
Yeah, I mean, for me, actually started just with the initial realization that I think we keep bringing up at every podcast, that the two battling theories in medicine right now, in health, and actually really in science in general. And one theory is that everything's static, and it's not just medicine. If you look at it, it's also the same thing in physics, same thing in chemistry, and in social sciences everywhere. And then, what we are is just a dumb byproduct of these unique idealized shapes and forms. It goes back to Plato. And then the other battle in theory is that everything is dynamic, everything is happening, continuously. And basically, to me, it always helps to keep in mind that those are the two distinctions. And it helps a lot when you're reading articles and studies, because you can immediately kind of gauge where a specific article is which direction it's gonna take. If it's going to be the mainstream view that everything is genetic, or if it's going to be the energetic view, or somewhere in between. So, initially I was getting confused when I was reading all this information, both from Pete and from the mainstream science outlets. But over time, it crystallized, what helped, at least in my case, was to keep in mind that, as I think it was Ray who said, ideally things should never make sense until they make the right sense.
Yeah, he said
if you're
they should
confused,
make no sense till they make the right sense. Yeah.
exactly. So if you're confused and things don't make sense, that's actually the right state of mind to be. Like if everything makes sense from the very beginning, you're either deluding yourself, or you're working off of a really like a tautological theory that everything can be proven true just for your sake, to convince yourself that you're right. You don't want to be in that state. So if you're confused, if you're overwhelmed, that's a normal state. Over time, this feeling of being overwhelmed should dissipate, because more and more things will make sense. And then, you'll probably start developing these almost like moments of insight, where you'll have the aha moment. And the more you read, the more you experiment, the more often this thing happens. But even for a person, I'm sure the same thing happens to Ray. Even for a person with a lot of knowledge in a specific area, given how quickly the world is changing, how much new information comes at every second, I think even those people are confused most of the time. It's just that they've acquired enough knowledge to kind of know better how to deal with this incoming flow of information. That's really the goal at the end. Like, there's no final state of knowledge. Everything is developing. Everything is going to continue to develop. Science is open-ended and infinite, just like every other aspect of life. So really the goal is to acquire enough knowledge, enough know-how to understand how to handle and kind of separate the noise from the signal. Basically, that's what engineers say, signal to noise ratio. So it's the same thing here. And it took me about 3 to 4 months when I first started reading Pete. I did have a bit of a background in biochemistry, but it still took me 3 to 4 months to understand what he was talking about. And then I spent another few months vetting his resources. I don't think people need to do this anymore, because at this point, the evidence is overwhelming that at the very least, the man is on the right track. I don't know. I mean, if people feel overwhelmed, again, my words of encouragement is that's a good state. It's a normal state to be in. Just keep reading, keep following up on what we present and what we discuss. Eventually, just as Buddha said, doubt everything, find your own light. So eventually you'll find your own path. Hopefully you'll still be along the energetic pathway, but it will be your own unique way of looking at the world, which will still carry the correct message.
Who said that if you're on somebody else's, oh shit. It was like something about you're doing it wrong if you're on somebody else's path. I can't believe I'm forgetting this quote. Yeah, it's by the guy that wrote The Hero's Journey, I think. I forgot his name too. But my experience is that, so when you're reading studies, let's say, or you're reading what somebody else wrote, you're looking at the world through their eyes, right? And the goal is to eventually look at the world with your eyes, using this accumulated knowledge from other people, or even and also your own. Shoot, okay, I just dropped this. It was something like if the path before you is clear. Steph is amazing. If the path before you is clear, it means you're on somebody else's. So, Again, I can't believe I forgot that quote. I love that quote. I have other quotes from like Spinoza and people, and I think all this stuff is about like knowing yourself. And everybody, like we all have the same hormones and our stress systems work in a similar way, but like it's to discount, like to say that everything is figured out and all you have to do is eat this diet. It's to negate the person's history and experience with their what they had during gestation and their parents and their schooling experience. And so that's what I find myself explaining that often. And so again, if we could just nail that into the ground, that's always, I think, useful to say, because again, a lot of people on YouTube especially are saying eat this diet and kind of disconnect. Basically, it's all about eating this thing, and I think it's so much more than that. Although I think broadening that perspective, if you do think like that, can take a while, and it's not necessarily easy either.
Yeah, I think the only thing that's kind of, well, I don't want to call it set as a diet. The only thing that makes this diet a diet is that it has a preference for carbs, and a little bit it tries to not emphasize the fats. But there are situations where, let's say, all you have is saturated fat, and then basically you have a choice between like a high PUFA meal or a high saturated fat meal. Now, a Petarian way would still be to go with a high fat meal but choose a saturated fat one. So it's not like a one set thing for every situation. Every situation will be different given what's available to you. I mean, I think somebody asked Ray, I said, so all of these rules you're giving, all of these suggestions, they make it really hard to eat. Like, is it possible in the modern world to eat perfectly? And then he responded by saying, if by perfect you mean choosing wisely among available options with a good knowledge in your head, then yes. Otherwise, no, right? So just throwing some rigid rules out there, I don't think anybody is expecting that this is the ideal way to live. I mean, we all live pretty flexible and ever-changing lives, so it's just a matter of choosing wisely. Reducing entropy is really what it's all about. But by making intelligent choices that are informed, you tend to reduce entropy and move in the right direction. But it's not going to be A through Z and then you repeat it every single time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, we'll jump into the news now. So your first article on hateit.me, if you want to follow along, and please, I must have missed it. If somebody says my volume is too low, maybe Steph, give me a heads up if you're there. But anyways, ALS tied to increased fat oxidation, increased glucose may treat it.
Yep. So this was, and if you look at the actual study, the authors themselves said that this was a shocking discovery. Because of according to mainstream medicine, ALS has no known cause except for the very small percentage where they claim it's familial, right? But the vast majority of the ALS cases are not. So there have been multiple proposals of what may be causing ALS. Of course, there's always the virus hypothesis, the bacterial hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, people that get diagnosed with ALS continue to die. It's a neurodegenerative condition, and you're expected to live no more than 5 years after getting diagnosed, even with the best line of therapy, which really means the most aggressive line of therapy, which may end up actually killing you faster than if you didn't do anything. Stephen Hawking, the late physicist, had a form of ALS, and as I said in the post, one thing that's interesting that separates him from the rest of the group is that he kept taking aspirin about twice a week. So I'm given that now the study says that ALS is tied to increased fat oxidation and wastage of glucose. Now I'm thinking whether this excessive lipolysis, basically, that's underlying ALS, maybe that's what kept Stephen Hawking alive for several decades. Towards the end of his life, a few bright minds in neurology, I'm putting in quotes because they weren't bright at all, they basically got on TV and said, we really don't think he had ALS, because we don't know of a single case of that person with ALS would survive that long. It must have been a very peculiar disease that we still don't know what it was. Well, so what was that thing like when you defy the diagnosis? What does the doctor do? Says, well, maybe the original diagnosis must have been wrong. Like, I didn't diagnose you properly with terminal cancer because you're still alive, so you can be cancer. So same thing here. So basically, two studies. One of them that showed that. The preliminary one one of the study quotes the other, but basically one of them said, Okay, so ALS is characterized by increased fatty acid oxidation in the muscle and the brain. This automatically, because the Randall cycle upregulates glycolysis because the cell perceives this as an insufficient access to glucose, and whatever glucose gets given to the cell gets wasted as lactic acid. So the study that looked at actually treating it said, okay, so what happens if we increase basically the supply of glucose to the cell? And that's the only thing they changed. And they used a fly model. I think it was a Drosophila fly model. And it's not the best model, but still considered pretty relevant for ALS. And just a simple increase of the availability, the dietary availability of glucose, it was a pretty hefty increase. It was 5 to 7 times the regular daily amount in the diet. So I guess that means for a person that's, I don't know, that's eating, I don't know, 10% glucose daily or 20, that means increasing it maybe, I don't know, several fold. Anyways, bottom line is that the flies basically stopped declining, and some of them basically looked like they never developed ALS to start with. And long story short, the study basically said that ALS, just as many other diseases that we're seeing lately, seems to be very much a metabolic condition. And considering the fact that ALS is a wasting disease and it has this increased lipolysis, increased fatty acid oxidation, increased wastage of glucose, I made the statement in my post that, well, this sounds like two other wasting diseases that we know of, cancer and diabetes type 1. They're both wasting diseases. So my proposition was, has anybody tried treating cancer and diabetes type 1 by increasing glucose availability? Now, I know Ray has said that back in the early 20th century, somebody did try treating diabetes with glucose. I think they gave people up to like 8 to 10 ounces.
Dr. Piorry, Piorry, and Dr. Budd. I have like at least one of their original papers. But I think it was, it's 10 to 12 ounces of pure white sugar or something.
There you go. So my proposition was do the same for cancer and diabetes. And by the way, because the wasting syndrome of ALS, it looks almost identical, if not entirely identical, to the ones for cancer and diabetes type 1. And we already know, at least several studies have come out with claims saying that it's the excessive lipolysis that triggers the wastage. So anything that blocks this excessive lipolysis, niacinamide, aspirin, vitamin E, thyroid, etc., should actually be able to stop the wastage as well. So, and then I concluded the post by saying, well, maybe that's why Stephen Hawking lived for all these decades. He took two aspirin tablets twice weekly. So that's a gram of aspirin twice a week. That's probably enough to have benefit. And reminding me of Ray's friend, he mentioned in one of his interviews a guy who he knows very well who got diagnosed with ALS and decided he didn't want to treat it. He didn't want to go through all this because there wasn't any good treatment center close to where he lived. So he had to travel like a few hundred miles to go to like a center, and they still told him the same thing. Look, buddy, you're like 75. You'll be lucky if you reach 80. So he said, you know what? I want my quality of life. So he basically called Ray, and Ray said, well, why don't you start taking more aspirin? So he used, I think Ray said he used anywhere between 1 and 3 grams daily for the first 6 months. And then he dropped that basically. He started taking it only like a tablet a day. And initially he kept declining, and that doctors will tell him, look, the end is near, you got to put your affairs in order. And then he stopped declining, and apparently he's still alive. So yet another quote unquote mysterious terminal disease turns out to be rather simple, rather straightforward. It's once again the oxidation of fat is detrimental, and what we're seeing this lactic acid. Just as it's in cancer, it's because the cells perceive this as a lack of glucose. If you provide more, the cells turn out to be remarkably resilient and fully recoverable, as the study itself said.
Sweet. And just before we move on, one of the signal that the lactic acid, that can direct, I know it does many things, but one of the problems is it signals the pituitary, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
And triggers seizures and all kinds of other things in the brain. Yeah. And if you want, we can talk. I mean, there's one or two more about cysteine in cancer. That's probably pretty well known to people at this point. But
was that under your ALS? Oh yeah, blocking cysteine.
Yeah, blocking cysteine. So cysteine is basically the direct precursor to glutathione, and it's cysteine. I guess I don't know how it's pronounced. I guess cysteine. There is also the amino acid cysteine, which is different, but cysteine is the precursor to cysteine, and cysteine is the precursor to glutathione. Long story short, blocking one of these building blocks of glutathione, cysteine or cysteine, basically it almost immediately kills cancer stem cells. And the keyword here is the stem cells. So the problem with the current treatments of cancer is that you go for surgery, you go for radiation and chemotherapy, and then for about 6 to 9 months, usually on average, you feel fine. If the cancer is operable, they take it out, right? And you go through a round of chemo radiation, and you think you're clean. But unfortunately, between 9 months and 12 months after all these procedures, not only the cancer comes back, but it comes back metastasized and really aggressive, and then it's essentially at that point it's almost like a death sentence. They're starting to count the clock. So, long story short, now science says that the reason cancer comes back is because the seeds of cancer, which are the cancer stem cells, they haven't been taken out, they haven't been killed, they're all over. So first of all, that statement itself is pretty seminal. It's pretty monumental because it means that cancer is a systemic disease. Mm-hmm. So anytime you go to an oncologist or a doctor and they tell you have liver cancer, you should be laughing in their face. It's not liver cancer. It's cancer that somehow manifested in the liver. But and they're developing these therapies trying to deplete glutathione. It's the reduced form of glutathione, GSH. It's another biomarker, by the way, of the redox status. The ratio of GSSG to GSH is just like the NAD to the NADH ratio tells you how oxidized the cell is.
In the pyruvate to lactate?
Exactly.
Ratio.
Pyruvate to lactate, NADH to NADH, acetoacetate to hydroxybutyrate. All of these are biomarkers for redox status. And basically, cancer cells have the redox balance shifted dramatically in favor of reduction. So they have a ton of antioxidants in the form of glutathione, and they really have a formidable reserve, and that's how they protect themselves from chemotherapy, from the immune system. By the way, immune system can't touch a cell that's in an extremely reduced state, and then many different approaches have shown that anything that can shift this balance even a little bit towards the oxidative state, then makes the cancer cell really vulnerable to all kinds of radiation, chemotherapy. All of these are methods for increasing reactive oxygen species, right? Mm-hmm. But if the cancer cell has enough supply of cysteine, it can regenerate a glutathione pretty reliably and very quickly. So where does it get its cysteine from? Well, aside from the diet, your muscles have a lot of cysteine. Mm-hmm. So that's why when you start messing with the cancer, usually what happens is basically that the cancer upregulates the production of cortisol and starts getting cysteine from anywhere, which means your muscles in this case. But this study showed that if you block the uptake of cysteine inside the cell, the stem cells, the cancer stem cells, can no longer synthesize glutathione, and they died immediately on their own. They triggered this this form of apoptosis, and there was no need for any treatment. There was no need for chemotherapy. There was no need for radiation. The stem cells died on their own, and it was almost overnight. So once again, as I said in this post, basically this is another way of depleting glutathione. So other non-toxic ways, which we've mentioned before probably, include aspirin, eating more glucose, same thing as the study for ALS, methylene blue, thyroid, progesterone, all of these things powerfully shift the balance of the redox status towards oxidation. So even if they don't deplete glutathione altogether by blocking cysteine uptake completely, at the very least they'll shift it to the point where actually the cell, as Ray said, is once you shift the balance towards oxidation, the inside of the cell starts to become acidic. And as soon as that happens, any cell that is unhealthy, it's already a signal for the cell to undergo apoptosis. It's only the alkaline environment that's preventing these disturbed, quote-unquote, cancer cells from killing themselves. They want to, but they can't. But as soon as you shift the redox balance towards oxidation, they acidify and they can undergo apoptosis on their own. There's no need for toxic treatments.
And are people in the health world, they're supplementing with the reduced form of glutathione, and so that would be. I know it has its role in cellular proliferation, but you wouldn't want to be supplementing with that. That could again add to that shifted, reduced redox balance.
They also supplement with NAC, which is also that's really dangerous. I think the confusion stems from the fact that NAC is used in hospitals, mm-hmm. and it's given to people that come in with acetaminophen overdose, Tylenol mm-hmm. overdose, mm-hmm. because Tylenol tends to deplete glutathione as well. So they inject you with the NAC, but there's no need because glutathione is composed of glycine, the amino acids glycine and cysteine.
Uh-huh.
So you always have enough cysteine. Don't worry. There's always some muscle breakdown. So you're never low on cysteine. What you're really low on is glycine. So human studies with people with HIV have shown that providing just a few grams of glycine dramatically increase the rate of synthesis of glutathione, but only if you need it. Mm-hmm. But if you take the NAC, this extra NAC has to go somewhere. So there's only two pathways. Either you're going to increase glutathione, even if you don't need to be increased, which can be very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And the second pathway is this amino acid will be oxidized as fuel, which means you're going to generate ammonia. And if, God forbid, there is any cancer somewhere, ammonia stimulates cancer growth as well. So NAC is really a no-go. I've asked Ray multiple times about it. He's very consistent about that one. He hasn't changed his mind over the last 5 years. He keeps saying Arginine and NAC are a no-no.
That was one of the supplements I supplemented with so often, like when I was into different anti-aging supplements. So it's just funny that is so harmful. Okay. Consciousness is quantum can be inhibited or enhanced with specific chemicals. Yes,
that's a really interesting study. And I'm waiting. I sent an email to the person who wrote the editorial for the study. He hasn't responded yet. He's a doctor at the University of Arizona. But the anesthetics are kind of a mystery. Nobody really knows how they work. Mm-hmm. What is known is that the power of an anesthetic to anesthetize, to basically reversibly remove consciousness from a living organism, is correlated with how soluble the anesthetic is in oil. The more lipophilic the anesthetic, the more powerful it is, and it works in lower dosages. So what the study did is basically it took one known anesthetic, the noble gas xenon, and basically the xenon has a number of different isotopes. So they tested the different isotopes on animals and found out that one of the isotopes actually has no anesthetic effect, and that really puzzled them. And then they did a number of different tests, and it turns out that a quantum property of the isotopes determines whether there will be anesthetic or not.
Can I pause you for 1 second? Yes. What is quantum? Like what does that word mean?
Well, related to quantum mechanics. So in other words, things like entanglement, Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, mm-hmm. Instantaneous communication, mm-hmm. Basically a situation where you can have a superposition of quantum states. Mm-hmm. In other words, like flipping a dice in a quantum world, you can have the dice until somebody looks at it. The dice actually lands on all 6 sides simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So you can have 1 through 6 as a result until somebody looks at it, and then the dice kind of decides which side it really wants to be on in the macro world. So really strange things. This quantum mechanics, it's basically it's the physics of the very small, of the really small distances, really small particles, really small amounts of energy.
Well, not to get too off track, but wasn't Mei Wan Ho talking about like quantum electron transport within the cell or something? Because I guess that's my only point of reference for that word.
So these guys say that in their opinion, so the study concludes by saying that the fact that the different chemicals, basically the same molecule but with different quantum property known as spin, mm-hmm. And basically they found out that it's the value of the spin, in this case 1/2 So basically spin in quantum world, nuclear spin of the nucleus can be either 0, can be 1, or can be basically like these fractions of full integers. And it turns out that if a chemical has a spin of 1/2, it will actually enhance consciousness. It will not block it. So the editorial concludes by saying that many other chemicals, drugs/supplements will probably have the same effect. And they also talk about microtubules and how consciousness is probably basically an entanglement effect of microtubules in basically getting into a quantum entanglement with each other. And these microtubules are all over your brain. So they give the example of when you see an object on the street, different parts of your brain process that this object, say, is a car. Mm-hmm. Different parts of your brain process that this object is red. Different parts of your brain process the noise that this object makes, etc., etc. Yet somehow your consciousness perceives this as a unified object with unified properties that somehow it all flows together and it happens instantaneously. And their proposition is that that's the consciousness. And actually, it's not their proposition, but they're saying that their study confirms that consciousness is likely a quantum entanglement effect between the different areas of the brain. We have these structures called the microtubules, and these microtubules can actually communicate with each other and be entangled. They form the same system in the quantum world, even though macroscopically they're separate entities. And because like these various different chemicals, really different molecules, but with the same spin, have such similar effects on consciousness, the researchers thought that this implies that consciousness is also a quantum effect, because nothing else in those molecules could explain why they affect consciousness. And I wrote the guy who wrote the editorial, and I said, I don't know if you're familiar, but pregnenolone is actually one of the most potent known stabilizers of the microtubules. And there's this guy out there who I didn't want to mention the name. I think it was Alex Jones, who sells pregnenolone and calls it the red pill. Are you familiar with that?
No, I didn't know.
Now, of course, it could all be just a coincidence, but it's the fact is that pregnenolone is also known clinically for opposing the effects of various anesthetic chemicals, like benzodiazepines, opioids, ethanol. I don't know if it's been tried on real anesthesia, but pregnenolone seems to be a consciousness-enhancing chemical, and this matches very well with its effects on the microtubules. So I wrote to that person and said, are you familiar with this property of pregnenolone? And by the way, what other chemicals are you referring to by saying that they can enhance or inhibit consciousness? So let's see what he has to say. But I thought it's pretty fascinating that, you know, some simple chemicals that we take for granted on a daily basis can actually have such dramatic effect on consciousness based on their quantum properties. And we're just beginning to learn about those.
Well, I hope I don't get this wrong, but I feel like I was sifting through one of Ray's articles, the references, and he had specifically pointed out estrogen being harmful to microtubules.
Oh,
like,
wow.
That they damage it. I feel like I remember thinking that was probably important and probably putting it in my notes.
Yeah, and by the way, the same studies that talk about pregnenolone's effect on microtubules, they also tested progesterone. It has almost the exact same effects as pregnenolone. It's slightly weaker. But if I remember the numbers correctly, basically if pregnenolone enhanced structural stability 5-fold, progesterone is like 4-fold. So it's not that far behind. So again, I think ultimately I think we're getting enough clues to see that many of the chemicals that we ingest or surrounded by or interact with on a daily basis, many of their properties are affecting us not necessarily at the chemical level. So this of course can be could have many different meanings, and one of them is that just because the FDA tells you that a chemical is completely harmless because this structure is known to be harmless, doesn't necessarily make it so. It means that there is a ton of other properties that we're still learning, that we're just beginning to learn, and they affect something as fundamental as consciousness. So I think we need to be very careful, and I think now I'm starting to realize more and more why Ray's so careful about supplements and about putting things in his body in general. There's just so much that we don't know, and it goes way beyond simple chemistry.
What is it? The precautionary principle?
The precautionary principle, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So we're at the 30-minute mark. We have at least 15 patients with brain injury, and we also have the human organism is an electrome, and diseases can be cured. Any preference?
The first one can be summarized very quickly. As many people know, after a person has a brain injury, let's say after an accident or like they're coming back from war, if there's a brain injury and the person is comatose, basically they'll do a basic assessment and say and give a verdict essentially whether this person is likely to recover or not. And as it turns out, that about 50% of these people that are comatose, and many of them are in persistent vegetative state, the doctors will recommend that these people are pulled off the plug. Basically, they'll say there's no chance of recovery. This person is gone, and the family will be kind of steered towards making that decision. Many times, actually, it's with an ulterior motive, especially if this person is an organ donor. Mm-hmm. A number of studies have come out about that. But in general, this study basically says that at least 15% of those people that we thought were completely unconscious and gone are actually not, and a significant number of them recovered. And of course, now I'm thinking, okay, so if this is the current estimate with current technology, what happens if technology improves and they just use a simple EEG device? But the EEG device has errors. Not all of them are very sensitive. What happens if technology improves and tomorrow it turns out it's 30%? And then what happens after that if it turns out after that it's 60%? So my point is that the brain, just as the study about ALS said, these cells that were thought, these organisms, these humans that were thought to be like irreversibly, terminally ill, all that was necessary to stop the decline and spur a recovery was providing extra glucose. So again, the precautionary principle, we shouldn't be steering people towards being killed and pulled off the plug just because our current knowledge says these people are unrecoverable. Guess what? Even now with current technology, we're now finding out that at least 15% of them are not. So that should give a pause to anybody, when they have a patient lying there in the hospital, steering their family towards making life, end of life decisions. I wouldn't take this lightly.
I pulled up an article. There is like an actual PubMed full article on it, but this is from NPR, and it's medical errors are number 3 leading cause of deaths. I bet it's more because I bet they're like generous with their what is and isn't an error. Like we could argue that the general treatment for different health issues or like serious medical conditions was an iatrogenic case. But
I'll give you an example. Many of the men with prostate cancer are given the androgen deprivation therapy.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, many of these men they don't die from the prostate cancer. They die from a heart attack or stroke because of the estrogen treatments and because of the androgen deprivation therapy. Now, this death is actually manipulated fraudulently twice. Mm-hmm. First of all, it will not be counted as a cancer death. So they will skew the statistics to show that the war on cancer is being won, when in fact this person died from things related to the cancer. Number one. Number two, it will not be counted as a iatrogenic death. It will be counted as a natural death or as a death related to to a condition that the person has. Mm-hmm. It's not because the doctor castrated this person chemically. It will never be counted as but I'm just giving an example of a significant number of cases where this should be counted as a iatrogenic death, but it isn't. So you're right. I don't think it's number 3. I would actually go as far as to say it's probably number 1. Because if this is number 3, I'm guessing that the number 1 and number 2 are probably either drugs. I think drugs are actually, and they're counting them separately from iatrogenic deaths. I think drugs and medical procedures are not counted together.
Well, this is a little bit older. I think it's from 2016, but they say heart disease and cancer. But yeah, where are like suicides and drugs and things?
Precisely. Yeah. And by the way, now cancer has overtaken heart disease. So cancer is number 1. I think I posted a study on that about a year ago.
We can move on, but the scariest thing ever to me is castration-resistant prostate cancer.
Wow.
Not only, I don't mean to laugh at it, but it's like living in Looney Tunes.
It's a horror.
Yeah, it's like your theory of like what causes it is so ridiculously wrong that you've coined a term for castration-resistant prostate cancer. It's totally it's crazy.
So next thing you know, we're gonna have execution-resistant criminals. How dare they not die after everything we've thrown at them, right?
I mean, it just highlights like the insanity of like the medical mind. But okay, do you want to go to?
The human organism is an electron. This is another study. It's an extension of the few that I posted on cancer being a metabolic disease. Mm-hmm. And this is an essay written by a doctor. And basically, the essay says the discussion that we kind of do a summary of every podcast. That's exactly what this essay is about. The essay says, well, look, we've been told that the organism is basically a collection of genes and proteins. But guess what? There was another theory. And it was very popular in the early 20th century that said that basically all disease is electronic in origin. And it was diagnosed with these electrode machines. Basically, it was diagnosed with EEGs and EKGs, even cancer. And basically the dominant theory at the time was that all of these diseases stem from a disturbance in the electron. An electron is the unique composition of electrical fields that compose you, that make you. Same thing as the genome, but it's the electrical version of it. And then the essay goes into the discovery of the DNA by Watson and Crick. And then it says, for some reason, and they don't specify what, for some reason that idea won it won dominance in the 20th century. But as the essay says, Unfortunately, didn't produce much, and now we're back to square one where we were 100 years ago, and we're now trying to revive that idea that basically diseases are metabolic in origin. And they give an example of how just blocking like a single ion channel, the sodium channel with drugs, completely prevented metastasis in a number of different lethal cancers, like a lung cancer or a brain cancer or even pancreatic cancer. And they're saying that, if something so simple can have such a dramatic effect, this theory needs to be taken seriously, probably a lot more seriously than the genetic theory, because just as you and I discussed 3 years ago, the genetic theory so far has produced exactly squat. And now the more voices are being raised saying enough is enough. Let's go back to where we were, because we had some results back then and we have nothing now.
Yeah, I was going to pull up that podcast just to put it on the screen. But that book, Cold War in Biology, which I named this podcast by Carl C. Lindgren, it really goes into the history of how that genetic determinism view came about. And man, you think things are built with good foundation, but again, as your consciousness expands, you realize it's like just there are sinister motives behind a lot of things,
Yeah. Even if they're not sinister, many times actually a lot of times it's politics. Sometimes it's sheer stupidity. But in general, it's just, I guess, just battling of just relationships, people being pinned against each other, and not really, you would think that in science the best idea wins, but it turns out that science is no less political than politics. So it's the same thing.
That's a better way of saying it. But Ray had quoted, I forget the guy who did the quote, but it's like 20 morons in the same place can kill a science. But Gilbert Ling quoted somebody else saying that. And I mean, Gilbert Ling, if anybody really understands that quote, Okay.
One more. I think the statins are useless. I think that's a great one, because I bet not many people have heard about this study. So in 2016, this is actually an older study, and I don't know how I didn't come across. I may have, but I don't remember it. Basically, this study was published in BMJ of all places, and it was the most massive study ever undertaken on studying the effects of statins and the effects of high cholesterol. And what it found out, a couple of things. And by the way, the title "Statins are useless." Those are the verbatim words of the lead author of the study. They're not mine. He said useless. So if a person can get on the record and on the front page of BMJ and say that, that behind the scenes he's thinking they're not useless, they're killing people, but I'll get fired if I say that.
Yeah, cholesterol does not cause heart disease in the elderly, and trying to reduce it with drugs like statins is a waste of time. Wow, yeah. The benefits from statin treatment have been exaggerated.
And what's more, when they actually looked at the cholesterol, they found that not only does it not cause heart disease, but actually older people over 60, confirming what Ray has been saying so many times, the higher the cholesterol, the longer they lived. So I remember a few people in their 60s sent Ray an email saying, "Oh, my doctor is really worried about my cholesterol. Like it's 205." And Ray came back saying, like, "I think it's kind of low."
205.
Yes, you should. He's like, he didn't say you should raise it, but he said study has shown consistently that people over 60 have a dramatically lower chance, dramatically lower all-cause mortality if their cholesterol is between 250 and 270. And at that number, your doctor will be freaking out.
And it's worth saying, like, when you're there is some kind of differentiating point. As you get older, it's better for the cholesterol to be elevated, but it's still a sign of thyroid suppression. It wouldn't mean that person wouldn't be able to use a thyroid supplement, decrease their cholesterol, and be in better health.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think the only comment was that you shouldn't be blocking your synthesis of cholesterol, because that's a really bad way of getting rid of it. It's like, this is the raw material, you're not using it properly, so make sure you change things so you use it properly, but don't get rid of it. Don't get rid of its synthesis. That's a very bad way of treating this non-disease, because it's not even a disease.
Yeah. Well, do you want to just talk about real quick I don't know if this was what you mentioned it in this oh shoot, I just lost it. The STARS article, but I did put Electric Universe on the title of this episode. Do you want to maybe give just your your general thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Or you can talk about this article too.
I mean, basically, so this study showed that under specific conditions, such as extremely high pressure, gas such as hydrogen can actually turn into a metal, and it'll be a solid thing. And it's basically you're touching metal, you're picking up a metallic object, but it's actually made of hydrogen instead of carbon. All right, and basically they're saying that they think that this type of metallic hydrogen metal or metallic hydrogen is what composes the majority of a star's matter, and get super gaseous planets such as Jupiter or Saturn. And the reason it attracted my attention is that the electric universe theory is all about these powerful electromagnetic fields generated by stars, and mainstream physics basically says no, that's not possible. Basically. From what we understand, all stars are just made of gas, and they're mostly like a nuclear fusion reaction. And even if they're spinning, they wouldn't generate that powerful of an electromagnetic force. And the electric universe theory is saying no, that's not true. The electromagnetic field is very powerful, and then the disconnect has always been that the nuclear fusion physicists have always said, well, how can a gas create this powerful electromagnetic field? And I think the electric universe people up until now did not have a very good answer. But it will become a very good answer if it turns out that stars are actually metallic balls that are spinning very rapidly. That's all you need to generate a very powerful electromagnetic field due to something called Barnett effect. It's really strange. And actually, this goes even deeper because it shows the Barnett effect actually says that any body of matter, regardless of what it's a gas, metallic bodies do it particularly well. Any body of matter, if you start spinning it, even in a vacuum, it generates itself. Basically, it creates an electromagnetic field, which is parallel to the axis of rotation. And I had a discussion with a guy on the forum. I think his name was it was Drareg. And then there was this other guy, like the pimp moniker. I think they both have experience in physics, and basically both of them said that this may account for gravity, right? Because if a spinning body, and for what we know, every large cosmic body that we know of spins, then this may explain gravity. That you don't need any kind of like a bending space-time. All you need is actually electromagnetic phenomena. And it's due to the fact that any body of matter, but specifically ones made of metal, generate powerful electromagnetic fields if they rotate, even in a vacuum. I started watching it, and basically, I think it's like a 2-hour movie or something. So I watched the first 10 minutes. I haven't finished watching it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think everybody has a piece of the truth. It's just a matter of seeing the commonalities. And to me, when a number of different people that don't necessarily know about each other's work, so the authors of the study that the inner core of stars and gaseous planets is made of metallic hydrogen, I guarantee you they don't know about electric universe theory. They seem like a pretty run-of-the-mill physicists. But if they're starting to write things that actually explain a lot of the missing points of the electric universe theory, I start to pay attention. In addition, Tesla, when they asked him like how you plan on transmitting electricity through Earth, and he said, well, unbeknownst to most of you, Earth is actually a large metal ball, and it's just encased in a very thin sheet, well, thin relatively speaking, just a few hundred kilometers or a few hundred miles of basically rock and dust and soil, but he said most of Earth is actually a metallic core. So it's a perfect conductor if you just know how to send the wave, the electromagnetic wave through the Earth. And then he said the same thing about every other heavenly body. He said that basically he did not know of a single example, and I don't know how he tested it. He did not think that a single body in our galaxy he didn't know of any body that is not capable of conducting electricity. And when they asked him why, he said the same principle as Earth, that the inner core was metallic. Now you can see how a statement like this can make Tesla look completely insane. If he says something like that about the sun or Jupiter or Saturn, which were at the time already pretty well studied, and people had an idea that they're mostly made out of gas. Sure. I think that's pretty much it. The moth is still there. I saw it. It keeps flying. Uh, s- Small intestinal candida is actually a pretty rare occurrence in my experience. Everybody has some amount of candida. At least most people do, but it's really not anything of concern unless you starve it, unless you deprive it of carbohydrates, and then it can become really invasive, and it's very dangerous. I mean, it can put a person in the hospital pretty quickly. So the candida.
Okay, I got my sound back on. Sorry, I must have muted myself by accident.
Did you mute it?
Yeah, I'm back. Okay.
Yeah, I was saying that most people have candida, but it shouldn't be a problem. It's not of the invasive kind. It only becomes invasive when you deprive it of carbohydrates. And if it starts becoming invasive, then it can be a real problem. It can land somebody in the hospital pretty quickly. So if it's of the non-invasive kind, which probably is, otherwise the person would know very quickly. You can usually keep it relatively at bay simply by not restricting carbohydrates. And I know people who've had some really good response to apple cider vinegar, specifically for candida. And methylene blue can probably help as well, but you'll probably have to use higher dosages. So I would actually try the methylene blue in combination with red light, which is called photodynamic therapy. So you'll probably be more effective that way. But in general, just keeping not restricting carbs and eating easily digestible foods tends to keep the candida as a non-invasive species. I don't think anything short of potent antifungal drugs can get rid of it completely, and those drugs are available, such as ketoconazole and miconazole, but they have some really nasty side effects, and I wouldn't use them unless the situation really calls for it. And for most people, it doesn't. So 5 to 10 milligrams of methylene blue, and then a 30-minute exposure to bright red light or sunlight should be enough to keep it at bay.
Guys, was I muted just when I was reading off the yellow stuff? Let me know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I do have a reference. I don't know how thorough it is, but they say whenever there is like a candida infection, the host is severely compromised.
That's
and
right.
So I thought that was interesting because it doesn't necessarily mean, oh, go after this fungus and try to kill it as well as you possibly can. It means there's probably something else going on, whether it be a low thyroid function, whether it be iron overload. I'm pretty sure that is like really related to fungal infection. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps.
It usually happens in like people with HIV, burn victims, people with severe malnutrition, people under tremendous stress. Usually people with PTSD actually tend to develop some kind of a candida overgrowth or like a small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And it's not a coincidence, simply because in those people it's been shown that the cortisol to testosterone ratio is really high, and that automatically suppresses your immune system to the point where you become a target for a lot of opportunistic infections. So yeah, just like you said, it's something else going on that's allowing this opportunistic pathogen to grow to the point where it's causing problems. Otherwise, it's basically no different than the herpes virus, which most people carry, but it almost never causes a problem. And since I said the herpes virus, however, in immunocompromised people, the herpes virus can be deadly. It can cause a very nasty form of encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. And in fact, many people with brain cancer tend to die not from the cancer itself, but from a reactivated herpes infection of the brain. I know several cases like that, and I think John McCain, late John McCain, senator, he actually died. The direct cause of that was the herpetic encephalitis. wasn't the brain cancer.
Speaking of him, I don't want to go off the deep end on this, but I feel like his death and also the elder Bush death were like two perfect examples of. I'm pretty sure in 50 years we'll find out some kind of CIA program to influence specifically how to think of those people, like Project Mockingbird, right. Some newer version, because it was so strange that like they were being represented in the way by all these different media outlets as really great people, and like it was just like Bush Senior, like a case could be made that he's like a war criminal, and I don't think McCain is much better. So it's just crazy.
Well, if not him, a lot of people in his administration, like Cheney and Rumsfeld and whatnot, they were part of his administration. So let's see what happens to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I wonder what happens to the guy that dies that shot some dude in the face with a shotgun, i.e. Cheney. Okay, we could probably talk about that for a while. This next question is from Mike Fave, and they say, for general health purposes across the lifespan for a man, how much testosterone and or DHT dissolved in vitamin E/MCT base applied topically to the skin would be safe to use while avoiding HPTA shutdown and other effects like aromatization? Could this be used in a stack with DHEA and progesterone? Thanks for your guys' time, content. Did you get all that?
Yeah. So how much? So initially I thought the question was to use testosterone and dihydrotestosterone in combination, because I know of people who do that.
You kind of did say that, yeah, at the beginning.
So the ones that I know that do use it that way, they use it in a 5-to-1 ratio in favor of testosterone. And basically they use 5 milligrams of testosterone and 1 milligrams of DHT, but they take this orally, and they use this 2 to 3 times daily, depending on how they feel. So I think with that dosage, now up to 15 milligrams of testosterone, I think is physiological. I know Ray has said that a young muscular man produces 5 milligrams a day, but I found other references that say this amount can go up to 18 milligrams daily. So I think 15 milligrams may be pushing it too far unless the person is hypogonadal and not producing anything of their own. But once or twice daily would be a good start. And then depending on effects, the person can gauge whether they need more or not. Now the problem with the testosterone and DHT is that they do tend to inhibit the synthesis of progesterone and DHEA. So it's important to take at the very least some pregnenolone with them. And the pregnenolone, as I mentioned in that study posted in the Pensteron thread, I think it was done by Celiac himself. He said that basically pregnenolone has a remarkable ability to, first of all, protect from many of the side effects of the end pathway hormones, number one. And number two, by combining with pregnenolone, you can use a lot lower dosage and still get the same effects. And finally, pregnenolone has been shown to be able to prevent to a degree the suppression of the HPGA axis when using endpoint hormones. Now, I still wouldn't use more than 50 milligrams testosterone daily or 3 to 5 milligrams DHEA. But I would take that with 30 to 50 milligrams of pregnenolone. Now, if progesterone and DHEA are also involved, then you can probably do, I think Ray mentioned to a few people that his current formula is he uses a progesterone to DHEA in a 3-to-1 ratio.
And last time I talked to him, he kind of said that he even used less DHEA. And I don't say that to say that anybody should mimic him, but to say that he is like, seems like he's always changing stuff. And
well,
so,
that's good.
yeah, which is good. But like, if you think you're going to be doing what he's doing, you're just you're so wrong, because
You're chasing like a moving target, right?
yeah. And also this again highlights what we were talking about earlier. He's not following some arbitrary plan. You know, he's presumably listening to his body and changing things based on that, and which I really think is the goal. But I'm sorry, keep going.
So I'll give you, actually, I'm doing some experiments myself with progesterone, DHA, and I have a few people in Europe who are actually doing some tests with our products and actually doing blood tests as well. So when we get these results, I'll publish them. But here are some few interesting findings. We've experimented with progesterone to DHA in a ratio of up to 7-1, and as long as you're taking at least 5 milligrams of DHA daily, there doesn't seem to be any negative effect on libido or muscle quality. In fact, they seem to be potentiating. So I think the actually, and now we're starting to find out just this last week, they did a test where they took 100 milligrams progesterone daily in DHEA and only 5 milligrams of DHEA. The results were still great. And basically, I think it shows that the only negative effects of progesterone might have been those relatively mild anti-androgenic effects. And as long as you give it a little bit of androgen, doesn't even have to be that much, doesn't even have to be a physiological dose, which would be up to 50 milligrams DHEA, then all of these negative side effects of progesterone seem to disappear. And now they love it. I mean, basically, one guy's a bodybuilder, and this is his stack. See, he doesn't use testosterone anymore. He doesn't inject it because nobody likes injections. Even hardcore bodybuilders don't like them. And now his stack is he takes 50 milligrams progesterone with 5 milligrams DHEA, and he repeats that 3 times daily. And he says that he feels no difference between that and his steroid regimen.
Wow.
So if that's the case, something that I would try, then you may not, that person may not even need testosterone or DHT. And if this stack works well, I would go with it, because these the DHT and progesterone, especially in these doses, tend to be safer than testosterone and DHT. There shouldn't be any suppression. And, I can launch into all the other benefits that progesterone has, but I think, we've already explained enough. I don't need to. So this person shouldn't need convincing that if progesterone and DHEA work, especially in this big ratio, then there's no need for further downstream hormones. Considering they're not over the counter, prescription is required. It's a controlled substance. You have no reason to use them unless they really do you something very good. And if progesterone DHEA can accomplish all of that, then there's no need.
Yeah, we can move on. But again, I think the barrier to the testosterone, the DHT, is like the finding a pure product, So again, I think that unless you're really confident with mixing powders and vitamin E and stuff, or buying a powder and then like understanding how to find if it's pure or not, which I have no fucking clue how to do. So it presents some barriers to the common man. Okay, so Beria says, are harmful inactive ingredients in beneficial drugs like cyproheptadine or thyroid unavoidable? Is it realistic to find good brands that only have starch in them? Seems like due to the industrial process, it is likely to always have some silica in there, even in the brands that Pete recommends.
I'll have to agree with that, but there are degrees of how harmful things can be. Sinoplus, somebody asked him about Sinoplus and the excipients in Sinoplus, and he said there's a little bit of talc, and I think starch, and I think calcium also as well, calcium carbonate. But he said the talc is not ideal, but it's still nowhere near as bad as the nanoparticles of silica.
Yeah.
Which it's the same, actually worse than ingesting powdered glass, because not only is this going to cause microbleeding in your intestines, but it will get absorbed into the bloodstream and then cause all kinds of nasty allergic/autoimmune reactions. If it's a pharma drug, chances are that it has some of those excipients. Supplement companies, they sometimes, now at this point they're aware that there's a market for cleaner supplements, so they try to put less, fewer excipients, but silica is still in many of them, and if not, They use titanium dioxide. They tend to use titanium dioxide. And most of the, usually the reason is that many of the vendors of the supplements, they don't make the supplements themselves. They outsource the production to a so-called CGMP certified facility, Common Good Manufacturing Practices. So the FDA requires that anybody who sells a supplement for ingestion, for an oral route, they have to produce these supplements in a specific facility, and there are protocols for the production as well. And I think many, if not most, of the officially approved, FDA-approved protocols for producing the supplements call for using these anti-caking agents like silica and talc and titanium dioxide, and or many of the gums, like carrageenan or like the guar gum or acacia gum or a locust bean gum. So it's really not so much the vendors as it is that there are only a few large manufacturers of supplements, and most of the other vendors who sell them actually contract with these manufacturers to have them produced. And they're at the mercy of the vendor they're at the mercy of this large manufacturer that has the facility, because that manufacturer will follow whatever the FDA has approved.
Yeah, and Ray a long time ago was asked a similar question, and he said something like their metabolic effect is so good that it kind of outweighs the bad stuff that's in them. And again, like we talked earlier, like there aren't that many options for these things. So unfortunately, like WP thyroid, it's similar to the Idea Labs one, where they just have few added things to the desiccated thyroid. So like you said, they're catching on that can be a marketing thing, and people want it. But yeah, I'm sure in the future they'll I hope supplements become cleaner and stuff. But
yeah, another factor is shelf life. Many of these vendors won't produce something that would last for as long as possible, and many of these agents that are being added, they're anti-caking / preservative agents. That's why they're there. If you don't put them in, you kind of have to sell everything pretty quickly. Otherwise, it starts to go bad. So a large vendor is unlikely to be interested in a pure product, not because they don't like that market, but because it costs them money to, if they have to throw this out after a few months, they don't like that. So they're going to a large vendor will almost always go with something that lasts longer. And usually the smaller vendors cater to the market of what people really want.
Mark says, I was wondering if you could give your opinion on succinic acid as a supplement, perhaps with dosage advice. Thank you.
I personally like it a lot, especially in combination with vitamin B2 and methylene blue. Succinic acid is part of a pharmaceutical drug developed in Russia called cytoflavin. Basically, it's a combination of succinic acid, inosine, and vitamin B2, riboflavin, and niacinamide. So these four ingredients. And in Russia, it's used for virtually everything. You go to a hospital for any reason and they hook you to an IV, chances are that IV will contain cytoflavin. They just dole it out like candy. It was originally developed in the 1960s as a non-toxic chemical to accelerate recovery from stroke. Then they found out it has the same benefits for heart attacks. Then they found out that it prevents many of these events to start with. Then they found out it can help chronic alcoholics to recover. Russia has a huge problem with chronic alcoholism. I don't mean to sound stereotypical. Many Eastern European countries are like that, including Bulgaria. And basically, succinic acid is a really quick way to really kickstart metabolism, because it goes directly into the mitochondria. And even if several steps of the Krebs cycle are not working, succinic acid happens to be the last step of the Krebs cycle before jumping on the electron transport chain. So even if you have a severely compromised metabolic chain system, as long as that one step converting succinic acid to fumaric acid is working, you can actually allow the cells to produce energy through the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, which by itself, just the very fact of forcing the cell into that pathway, has a number of different benefits. Typically, if you force a cancer cell even temporarily out of excessive glycolysis, it will induce apoptosis, because the intracellular alkalinity of the cell will fall. And as soon as you start producing energy through the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, you'll generate enough CO2 to acidify the cell internally, and then the cell will undergo apoptosis. So succinic acid is a very quick way to help a severely compromised cell, a severely stressed cell, to even briefly get out of that state. I think St. Georgi and even Otto Warburg, they use succinic acid in massive doses, mostly for treating diabetes. And the dosage that I've seen, they were all intravenously given, and they varied in amount from 5 grams to 60 grams per sitting. I don't think that much is needed, but of course they were treating, cases of people that were about to die, or diabetics that are wasting away. So in the amounts where it is known to be used preventatively, usually 200 milligrams to 300 milligrams per dosage, taken 2 or 3 times a day, is enough if it's going to help. So if succinic acid will be of any help to you, even these smaller amounts will be a very decent indication. It's similar to naltrexone, which Ray also recommends to people. And he basically says that use it for 2-3 days. If there is going to be a benefit, it will be felt in those first 2-3 days. Succinic acid, at least to me, acts the same way when taken on its own. And then when you combine it with methylene blue, it's an electron acceptor, so it helps the metabolism of succinic acid even more. In case there is blockage in the electron transport chain, or there is a buildup of NADH, or there is a buildup of FADH, which is the equivalent of NADH but based on vitamin B2. Methylene blue can help reoxidize these agents, and this spurs the metabolism of succinic acid. So I don't think you need to combine it with inosine the way it is in cytoflavin or even niacinamide. I think simply succinic acid with methylene blue makes for a great combination. And methylene blue, I almost never take more than 1 milligram per dose per day. I don't think it's any more is enough. And by the way, it builds up. It has a very long half-life in tissues, up to 40 hours. So even though in the blood the half-life is short, 1 milligram methylene blue over time will build up in the tissues, and that's what matters.
Sweet. Truthco says, what are the best ways to reduce peripheral serotonin and endotoxin, both with diet and supplements?
Well, if you're reducing peripheral, you will probably be reducing central as well. There are 2 different enzymes. Well, they're both tryptophan hydroxylase, but type 2 is in the brain, type 1 is in the GI tract. You can, aside from taking the TPH inhibitors, and currently there are multiple clinical trials of TPH inhibitors for treating obesity, treating diabetes, even treating cancer, specific cancers. But none of these are approved. So the dietary methods that are available to us over the counter are, first of all, avoid overindulging in foods that contain a lot of tryptophan. Muscle meats is a great example. It's very, very highly rich in tryptophan. So if you're going to eat these tryptophan-rich foods, I would add at least a spoon of gelatin with each meal, because it helps to block the absorption of tryptophan. And afterwards, even after tryptophan is absorbed, it helps to steer tryptophan away from serotonin metabolism and towards the synthesis of NAD and niacin, and consequently NAD. Taking aspirin with your meals also helps to inhibit the absorption of tryptophan. Taking some extra branched-chain amino acids also helps to limit the absorption of tryptophan. The amino acid phenylalanine and tyrosine, initially the research showed that they simply compete with tryptophan for absorption in the brain. Now they also show that the new studies have come out that show that these 2 amino acids compete with tryptophan for absorption in the intestine. So eating decent amount of protein that's poor in tryptophan, relatively poor in tryptophan, is a great way to over time deplete the tryptophan stores, or at the very least reduce the raw material for synthesizing serotonin. And if the amount of tryptophan available drops lower than normal, then even if you have endotoxin, basically you will not have the same pervasive serotonergic systemic effect, because there will be less tryptophan floating around. Keeping the free fatty acids low is a good approach, because free fatty acids can displace tryptophan from its binding site at albumin. That will increase both peripheral and central synthesis of serotonin. And in general, keeping stress low, because anytime your cortisol rises, it starts to break down muscle, and muscle is very high in tryptophan and cysteine as well. So all of these are, they're not necessarily very powerful, but they're systemic approaches to keeping tryptophan absorption / availability low, and consequently the synthesis of serotonin low. And of course, if really need be, you can buy something like phenclonine, the amino acid P parachlorophenylalanine, which is a direct TPH inhibitor. And there are a number of different ones out there at this point, but basically this is one of them. Caffeine, DHEA, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and aspirin to a degree are all known to be TPH inhibitors as well. And of these, the most powerful ones are progesterone and DHT.
I'm sorry, did you mention carbon dioxide? Because that helps the mast cells and then the platelets retain their serotonin.
No, I didn't, but I was strictly speaking about inhibiting the synthesis of serotonin. This is more like increasing the uptake of it once it's already synthesized.
And you have mentioned it primarily from the intestine, and then it's carried through the. Do you know like the concentration? I know it's mostly it's produced in the intestine, carried in the platelets, and didn't Ray say it was expelled or detoxified in the lungs? But
in the lungs, yes, in the lungs.
Do you know?
And it depends.
Go ahead.
Say it again.
The
detoxification depends on CO2.
Yeah, well, I've read, but the mast cells can be a huge, have a lot of serotonin as well.
Yeah. So my explanation was related to his question, which was how can we keep the synthesis of peripheral serotonin low?
Okay.
That's what I understood.
Sorry, I missed your first part. I was looking for something to augment what you were talking about, and I got lost. I apologize.
No, you did. You still did. It was basically after if we fail at preventing serotonin from being synthesized, what else can we do? And then I would have said CO2, right? And then aspirin is also a great one. Actually, it increases the uptake back into the platelets. So that's one way. Probably aspirin decreases blood pressure slightly. It's known to decrease it.
Sweet, thank you, Truchko. James says my cat has what looks like arthritis. Do you have any ideas what could be done to improve the situation from an energetic point of view, such as aspirin? Thank you.
I know two families, both of them with older cats, and both of them, one of them developed some kind of an inflammatory arthritis, and the other one had osteoarthritis. And in both cases, I recommend they try pregnenolone, and so far seems to be working really well. Even their doctor approves of it. And actually, I was kind of amazed. The doctor, when she realized that they're giving the cat pregnenolone, she said like, "Oh yeah, I'm like a 4th generation vet, and my great grandma used to do that like in the 1910s." So apparently it's known, like in the vet world, pregnenolone is known as a remedy for joint issues. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised it's not known in the human world. But anyway, so they were giving the cats 10 milligrams pregnenolone daily, and the swelling of the joints apparently completely disappeared. So I don't know I haven't seen any radiological images. I think the doctor is kind of cautious about that because the cats are old, and apparently like X-rays can really like mess with the cat's health, especially when the cat is older. Just that they can with ours, but apparently cats are more susceptible. So I haven't seen any radiologic images, but I know the cats are active because I visit those families every once in a while, and I play with the cats, and they seem fine. And before, they didn't want to move at all. They'll just lie in their cot and hiss at you, like if you approach and try to do something, try to play with them.
Somebody, I don't know if it's the same for a dog, but somebody asked Ray, and I think it was cancer for a dog, so it's different. But he was saying basically all the things that we talk about for cancer for a human, for the dog, but just in smaller doses. And so yeah. I don't necessarily for a cat or a dog, I don't know if it's necessarily you need an entirely different approach. And aspirin is and they make that for animals, so it's probably especially appropriate.
So I recommended aspirin, progesterone, and niacinamide, and the vet shut all of these down. So it's kind of like, look, when they ask me for an advice, I have to, of course, they're going to vet it with the vet. I'm not a vet, right? So even though they're my friends, they still go to the vet and say, "Hey, what do you think of this?" So I thought that the vet will shoot everything down, but she actually went with the pregnenolone, and she said, "Yeah, let's try this out." She's like, "I don't think it will work, but let's try it out." And it did work. So now the vet is okay with it. It's even prescribing it to the cat, but she's prescribing like the regular human capsules you buy from Amazon. Yeah. But basically she's doing it because the insurance of the cat covers it. And now all they do, they get these like 10 milligram capsules, they open it up in the cat's food, and they stir it up, and the cat eats it. So it's like, it's no different from us. It's the same thing.
Man, I really want us to comment on things that are going on in the chat, but it's going to be.
What's going on in the chat?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is really the place for it, but they're talking about political stuff, and Ray Pete often gets labeled like a communist.
Right.
And again, I think there's a real lack of like perspective of where he's coming from, and I can't speak for him, but I think has a very broad view of humanity and physiology, and like we've talked off air about how Ray thinks like the natural physiological state of material is altruistic,
Yeah.
And again, like his thoughts on this, I'm not saying he's right, like you have to believe him, but his thoughts are like incredibly deep. So when people like straw man his positions, it just like is like a little irritating. But again,
just keep in mind, he also said that Republicans used to be the very, very decent people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like he's just straight up like a hardcore lefty. I think he looks for opportunity. Like he said he looks for potential in any situation, right? So if he sees something good, like from the political ideas on the right, I don't think he's going to discount it. Now I'm kind of putting words in his mouth, but correct me if I'm wrong. But don't you think that in the last election, if he was forced to choose between the two candidates, don't you think he would have leaned a little bit more towards Trump? Like if he was forced to choose, right?
Well, I asked him what he thought of him, and he said he was basically immaterial, and how much could the president really do? But again, I think the biggest thing that people object to is him leaning towards like communitarianism in an America that is so.
It's a taboo. It's like you don't talk about that, right? It's all about individualism.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that again, and I know from my own schooling, I think that is just hammered into our heads. Like that is the way to be. And I'm not saying anybody has to. Like I don't even have like a point of view on politics specifically. I'm more interested in understanding how Ray is thinking, because I think his overall foundation is very interesting, so if energy and structure, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, let it throw keep going.
Yeah, but anyways, if energy and structure applies to our cells that are trillions of cells that are making us, like I think that energy structure thing also relates to like society as a whole, so and I know a libertarian would object and say like, well, you can have different types of society, and they could live anywhere how they wanted to live or whatever.
I think he's also a great defendant of personal freedom, and that's something that the libertarians should give him credit for. Mm-hmm. I think he's completely against of any authority telling a person what a person should do, and that's a core libertarian idea. Mm-hmm. So he's multiple times, I think he's come out and said things that are straight up from the very far right, and also like he's said things that are from the very far left, but it doesn't mean that he's associated somehow exclusively with either one of these ideas. It's simply what makes the best sense for the optimal development of the organism, right? And that doesn't make him a lefty or a righty. It's just a person who tries to get the best of both systems. And maybe all of these systems are our own stupid artificial creation. Maybe there's something beyond that he's after. And we're the ones trying to box him into these ideas, and he may be neither one of these.
And again, I don't understand Ray's work as much as the next person, but it's usually hearing a snippet and then that person trying to cram what he said into their specific box of like realm of understanding. And so again, like I'll try to keep an open mind, just because like I love when people say like Ray Pete is a genius about nutrition, but he's an idiot about politics. It's like, okay, it's like I find
they're one and the
same.
They're one and the same.
Well, I really feel like a person gives themselves away like when they say something like that, because I'm really suspect of their general understanding of what he's saying. So again, we could probably have an entire 3-hour podcast on this, but okay, this one somebody sent me this via email. Recently, I did an insulin tolerance test with my endocrinologist. I was given a large dose of glucagon, and then my blood was drawn at certain intervals. My level of human growth hormone barely rose above baseline in the 2 hours after taking glucagon. My endocrinologist diagnosed this as a pituitary issue and recommended exogenous growth hormone as a solution. Do you agree with this conclusion? Is there a better way to restore pituitary function?
I don't think this single test is definitive. I would repeat it. Basically, pituitary function and the way it responds to glucagon or gonadotropic hormone, it really varies and depends on the health state of the person. I've seen studies that show sleep deprivation can almost completely block the growth hormone response to glucagon. So if you're really tired or you didn't sleep well the previous night, or if you're hungry, I don't know if the endocrinologist asks you to fast. I would not necessarily take this. I mean, I wouldn't take this one test as a definitive diagnosis that it's a pituitary issue. I would ask for a repeat test, and preferably by a different doctor and under different circumstances. And I think it used to be actually a rule before a primary pituitary insufficiency is suspected. I think you'll have to do the test 3 times. That's how it at least used to be back in up until the 80s. And then they changed the rule, and now one doctor with one test can diagnose you like that. But I don't think it's definitive. The same thing happens with the so-called dexamethasone suppression test to determine whether you have like Cushing syndrome or depression. Basically, sometimes you go to a doctor, if you're really stressed out, you will not suppress on the dexamethasone test, but you will well rested, and unless you have Cushing syndrome, then you will suppress if you're in a better state of health. So I would ask for a repeated test, at least one more, preferably by a different doctor. Human growth hormone for an adult is very, very dangerous. In my opinion, it happens to be one of the most directly carcinogenic things, not because human growth hormone itself is carcinogenic, but it can reactivate dormant tumors very, very well. And now they're proposing that human growth hormone could be a biomarker for several different cancers, most specifically melanoma, I think pancreatic cancer, and neuroglioblastoma.
Isn't insulin the thing that would have increased the growth hormone? Doesn't hypoglycemia why would a doctor use glucagon to see if the growth hormone went up?
Well, I guess that's the test. I mean, that's how it's standardized. I think the insulin is more like whether your glucose will fall fast enough. Like for an insulin resistance, you'll be like, they give you this 75 grams of glucose drink, right? Mm-hmm. And you drink it, and then they draw blood, and they see, first of all, both how quickly your insulin rose and by how much, mm-hmm. and then how quickly your blood glucose dropped in the next 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And if either one of these, if you don't produce enough insulin, or if your glucose stays too high for too long, either one of these can be used to diagnose you as either insulin resistant or like a type 2 diabetic almost.
And I said this to him in the email, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the low pituitary, like maybe that's a real thing if somebody has like a physical injury to a pituitary, but
very rare.
That under-functioning pituitary is in Ray's painting of everything. Like that doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen, and if it does, and if it's naturally occurring, it's a blessing in disguise. You don't want your pituitary hormones to be high.
Again, your thyroid would be so high that your pituitary, hypothalamus, adrenals would be resting.
Will be suppressed.
Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Another one, I forgot the name of this person. He says, gentlemen, thanks for the mind-expanding live streams. What would you suggest for someone who gets bad stress reactions, fast pulse, elevated blood pressure, anxiety that lasts for an hour or two and ends with a bowel movement?
Well, it depends on the trigger, right? If it's something, if it's like a social situation or...
This person, they were specifically having that in the morning, I believe.
Well, in the morning, then I think it's a classic sign of low thyroid function, because it means, at some point throughout the night, your glycogen got depleted, and then free fatty acids rose, and then you're in a stress response. So if the urine is also foamy, that to me confirms that basically you're in a fatty acid oxidation mode. One thing that has been shown to completely prevent that stress response from happening is using cyproheptadine or any kind of other serotonin antagonist a few hours before bed. You don't even have to take them immediately before going to sleep. Something like 6 or 7 p.m. is enough, and it will basically stop the elevation of the stress hormones entirely. But even something like waking up in the middle of the night and drinking a little bit of milk with sugar, or a glass of orange juice, that's usually enough to prevent the stress response from happening, especially if you take a little bit of aspirin. But in general, to me, that's a pretty reliable sign that metabolism is low. The inability to tolerate prolonged periods of lack of food, which is what the night sleep really is. It's 8 to 10 hours of not eating.
Sweet, thank you. Nina K says, what are Georgie's thoughts on constant bloating? It gets really bad directly after eating, and the food seems to stay in my stomach for hours, which feels uncomfortable and makes me unable to eat as much as I need to increase my metabolism.
When it comes to women, a number of different things can cause this, but one of the most common causes is elevated estrogen, especially with advancing age. Estrogen is what slows down digestion, and it interferes with the absorption of many of the nutrients as well. Many women that undergo anti-estrogen therapy for a different cause, such as God forbid, breast cancer or endometrial cancer, they find that when they're given an anti-estrogen, their digestion dramatically improves. So I would recommend trying progesterone, and even before the progesterone, just in case there's some kind of a bacterial overgrowth. I think a week of trying a little some antibiotic, like from the penicillin class or the tetracycline, that would show if it's a dysbiosis issue. Or if it's hormonal. And if the antibiotic helps, then I think that's actually a better option. Just continuing with that antibiotic maybe twice a week should be enough to keep the bacterial overgrowth at bay. And if that doesn't help, then I'll try the progesterone. And studies with women with endometrial cancer show that 100 milligrams bioidentical progesterone daily was enough to improve their digestion. And keep in mind, they were giving these women prometrium, which is just progesterone dissolved in a really poor setup. It's with a little bit of peanut oil. So only about 14% gets absorbed. If you get the progesterone in vitamin E and oil, you probably get 80 to 90, if not even 100% absorption. So this means that if 14 milligrams absorbed progesterone was enough to dramatically improve digestion, that's how much you probably need to use up to 20 milligrams of a formulation that's in vitamin E.
Sweet. Did this? Yale has a question about succinic acid again, or an additional question. How would you explain the duality of succinic acid? On the one hand, it's a strong promoter of metabolism, is referred to anti-hypoxic. On the other hand, it inhibits prolyl hydroxylases and therefore stabilizes and even activates HIF.
HIF, yeah.
What does it stand for? I forget.
Hypoxia-inducible factor.
Hypoxia, okay. Thank you both as usual for taking the time and effort to do the podcast. It's truly informative and helpful. Thanks.
So I think the worry about succinic acid and HIF came from a few studies that showed that it's epidemiological studies that showed it may be a biomarker for certain cancers. But then all the actual intervention studies that use succinic acid showed that it has a really potent anti-tumor effect. And by the way, the dosage that we are discussing here, 200 to 300 milligrams, 2 to 3 times daily, that doesn't even come close to the amount that's being produced on a daily basis by the organism. We're talking more like a dosage that will act like a spark and kind of shake a cell out of its stress state. In order to really get to the point where succinic acid may activate HIF to a dangerous level, you're talking about these multi-tens of grams of doses that Otto Warburg and St. Georgi used, 50 to 60 grams per day as an IV dose. We're not there. I mean, 200 to 300 milligrams orally, 2 to 3 times daily, that's nothing. That will get metabolized before it gets a chance to do anything to HIF. So I wouldn't worry about it. And again, if necessary, I can send the studies with animals which show that much higher doses, several grams per day of the human equivalent, actually had a dramatic anti-cancer effect. So can be that bad if it's shrinking tumors, even tumors that are supposed to be lethal.
Sweet, thank you. This one's from Christoph Reisfelder. They say a recent study on the effects of glycine as a supplement showed it triggered a drop in body temperature and at the same time helped people both fall asleep more quickly and spend more time in REM sleep. How come a lower body temperature is desirable for restful sleep? Are we not aiming for an increased body temperature, or is that just for waking hours? Thank you.
I need to see the study and what exactly how they measure body temperature. If it was surface temperature, then many things can increase surface temperature but lower core temperature, and that's not a good thing. So, for example, people with elevated serotonin, elevated adrenaline, elevated cortisol, they have this reaction, where their skin flushes and they feel these heat waves. And if you measure the skin temperature, it's actually a few degrees above the core, but their core temperature is low. So these people are hypometabolic. So I need to see what they measured as temperature. I suspect that the glycine lowered skin surface temperature, which would be a good thing. And the reason why it helped with sleep most likely is because glycine is the major inhibitor neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. And it's only second to GABA as the inhibitor neurotransmitter in the brain. And glycine also happens to be a GABA agonist. So anything that acts as a GABA agonist will probably have a sleep-promoting effect. There are many drugs that are prescribed and abused as sleep inducers, and many of them, their main mechanism of action is GABA agonism. The benzodiazepines are probably the most famous ones and the ones most commonly abused. So it doesn't surprise me that glycine improved sleep. It's an inhibitory chemical similar to progesterone in activity. It's expected to do that. And the fall in temperature, I suspect it's not a fall in core temperature, it's a fall in skin surface temperature, which is good. It shows that it's lowering the stress hormones.
Sweet, thank you. This one is from Cam, and they say, is tanning your balls safe for increasing androgens? Every time I do, I usually spend 15 minutes with the boys in direct sunlight. Is moving and sort of swimming look that they... In direct sunlight, is the moving and sort of swimming look that they have while exposed to sunlight normal? I'm really fucking exposed to sunlight normal. Is this cholesterol converting from sunlight, or what is this movement I'm seeing? In general, are tanning beds a good option if no sun? I don't know what the movement he's talking about.
I don't know either, but I don't think to answer directly, I don't think tanning beds are a good option at all. They're pure UV light, and it's basically, you might as well be basking in the sun without any sunscreen, and even if you get sunburned badly, you'll be less bad than if you went into the sun tanning beds. Now, as far as increasing androgens, instead of exposing your balls to sunlight and risking like some kind of a sunburn and damage there, which can be dangerous because it increases the localized lipid peroxidation, it'll be a better option if you use red light. And there are multiple studies, even with primates, showing that just a few minutes of exposure of bright red light, exposing the gonads, the male gonads, to bright red light, it increased testosterone 200 to 300%. So that will be a much safer way because there shouldn't be any lipid peroxidation as a result of the red light, and red light is known to stimulate steroidogenesis mostly by lowering nitric oxide, which kind of removes a brake on metabolism. Yeah. Again, I can hear you.
Shoot. Okay. I'm back. Okay. How was I muted for the whole time talking about the monk fruit guy? Okay, whatever. I set a button to mute Georgi and I because it's way easier, and I think I accidentally keep pressing it. Anyways, I was saying that there's a funny cast of characters for the KMUD show, the monk fruit dude, and then yeah, we could probably talk about it all day, but it's hilarious.
It's just the same group of people that keeps calling, and I think I don't know, I guess they feel like part of like Ray's family, they want to hear him talk, so they call every single time. And there's this one old lady that really used to annoy everybody. She had a very interesting way of saying hello. And I don't know if you remember her. Like, she would call every show.
Well, one thing I remember pretty well was she was talking about serotonin with Ray, and she was really kept pressing him for how could a serotonin reuptake inhibitor have a good effect, and Ray was just like throwing out every different way that he could think of that, like by promoting stress or whatever.
Right.
And then finally, after talking about she was just like wasn't understanding or getting what he was saying. And Ray says something like everything I know suggests that it's like bad. And it was, I'd have to listen to it again, but it sounded like Ray was being put against a wall.
He's exasperated, right? Yeah. And she does this every single time with her questions. I don't think it's just him. I think Andrew genuinely hates her, but he can't cut her off. So he just gives out this grunt whenever she dials in, and it's almost like, oh, not again.
Man, what would we do without KMD? Okay, back to questions. Adrian Lacroix says, "Hi guys, I read legumes can actually lower the estrogen level with estrogen beta receptor," and I think that's the question. So, what do you think about legumes?
anything that you take that is an estrogen agonist would probably lower endogenous estrogen synthesis through a feedback mechanism. That doesn't mean it's good. The same reasoning was used to promote the sales of resveratrol, genistein, and daidzein, and they're all potent phytoestrogens, but all of these things are potent estrogens themselves. So I wouldn't take this as a good sign, as a good mechanism. Why would you take one estrogen to lower your endogenous one? You're still baiting in estrogens. And legumes are known to be highly estrogenic, and they can easily trigger abortion in ruminant animals. And sheep and goats, because I grew up on a farm, so I know that when sheep were pregnant, they would avoid legumes like the plague. We'll give them mixed hay, and they had some dried legume leaves, and they just wouldn't eat it. They would refuse to eat the entire stack of hay, so we had to replace it altogether. So I always wonder why, and the vet at the time told me that there's something in the legumes that's making the sheep abort. So they know about it and they avoid it. And now we know it has potent phytoestrogens. One of them, I think, is called 8-phenylnaringenin. Now, many people think, naringenin, Ray said it's a good thing. No, it's 8-phenylnaringenin. It's a phenylated version of naringenin. It's not the same thing. You cannot get it by eating naringenin. It's a very unique chemical, and it's highly estrogenic, and it's present in hops and in legumes.
And then, an easier to assimilate argument against eating them is just I think they have like crazy phosphorus content, so that'd be like a kind of a lowbrow argument.
They also have a high amount of methionine, which is also an amino acid you don't want to overindulge on.
Sweet. Thank you for that. Zach Bogley says, we're doing pretty well, by the way, on time and everything. But Zach Bogley says, "Hi, Danny. Would you and Georgie be willing to talk about the root causes of insulin resistance and fatty liver disease? Looking forward to the live stream. Thanks."
I think we covered that topic on the last podcast. We even covered a few studies showing that fatty acid oxidation, first of all, doesn't make you lose fat. Second of all, it gives you a fatty liver, and it also gives you an insulin resistance in the liver itself, to the point where the researchers were worried and said, in light of all these findings, we recommend that, extreme caution in terms of recommending low-carb diets to anybody, including young people, because the results that we saw here weren't good. So the low-carb diet gave people non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or not the people, but the animals that they were studying, and made them insulin resistant, and that insulin resistance started to spill over and go into the muscle as well. And once you have insulin resistance in the liver and in the muscles, that's diabetes type 2. So the core reason is stress, and the reason these elevated free fatty acids are running around is mostly due to low metabolism and or stress, which elevates cortisol and adrenaline. And currently there's a clinical trial with the anti-cortisol drug and also a well-known abortion pill, RU486, also known as mifepristone. And there is a clinical trial which completed successfully. It wasn't run by a pharma company. It was done, I think, at a university. And it showed that mifepristone can actually cure diabetes type 2 in humans. So right there, you know that cortisol, at the very least, is a major cause of it. Doesn't mean it's the only one. But other studies have shown that anti-adrenaline drugs like beta-propranolol and the anti-stress drug clonidine, which blocks adrenaline but also blocks partially cortisol as well. It blocks CRH in the brain. That those drugs in animal studies were also able to cure diabetes type 2 and fatty liver disease. So it all stems to excessive amount of fat in circulation, more than the liver can excrete more than the liver can process. So anything extra, the liver has to re-esterify and convert it to triglycerides. And actually, before the liver releases it back into the bloodstream, the liver actually stores the majority of it inside of itself. So anytime you have elevated lipolysis, even if it looks like you're losing body fat, and you may be losing body fat, keep in mind that simultaneously you're also fattening up your liver, because the liver has a fixed capacity of how much fat it can process. So when you elevate lipolysis artificially by running or cycling or doing anything, this basically depleting glycogen, and you're going into ketosis, into fatty acid oxidation mode, that directly damages your liver. And it makes the damages that much more worse if the fat is a PUFA. So, keeping lipolysis at bay, and then, at the very least, increasing the ratio of saturated fat to polyunsaturated fat. All of these are good ways to protect the liver.
Sweet, thank you. Ricardo Boy says, it seems that there is no assay currently available today that can measure full body estrogen load accurately. Georgi has mentioned that estrogen sulfate is a good, reliable serum marker, as it's a storage form of estrogen, as it can interconvert from/to estradiol. According to the study, it states that the tissue level can be 10 to 20-fold higher than the serum. I'm sure you've seen this study. Yep. I think it's in maybe menopausal women or something. Yep. That the serum and it's bound inside the cells, and thus is not able to be collected outside of the tissue biopsy, from my understanding. Thus, clinical assessment falls short or even impossible, and if so, misleading, which leads to inaccurate estrogen prescriptions by well-meaning practitioners. Do either of you see this differently?
No, I don't. I think estrone sulfate and prolactin, especially the latter one, are a great biomarkers. The first one is a great biomarker of total estrogen body stores. But prolactin is actually a great biomarker of estrogen activity inside the cell. So you can have a relatively high amount of estrone sulfate, but if you also have a relatively high amount of progesterone circulating around, or you're supplementing with it, or you're supplementing with something that blocks estrogen's effects, your prolactin will be relatively low. The worst situation would be if estrone sulfate is elevated and prolactin is also elevated. That means not only have all this extra estrogen floating around, but it is doing its bad things. So to me, those two are currently the most reliable biomarkers, and I will try to do them both. They measure different things, just like as I said. If your estrone sulfate is on the low end, but prolactin is high, that's still not a good sign. Ultimately, prolactin is a direct stress biomarker, both acute and chronic. So I would take prolactin very seriously, and I would probably take it over estrone sulfate if I had to choose only one. But yes, my understanding so far is that the current tests that are being done by endocrinologists for women almost always exclusively focus on estradiol, which is produced predominantly in the ovaries. So clearly after menopause, the levels of estradiol will drop tremendously. But there are other different forms of estrogen, and even though endocrinologists are perfectly well aware of them, they don't test for them. And not because they're dumb, some of them are, but simply the current FDA guidelines don't call for that. And if you want, because the endocrinologist will do everything possible to protect themselves from getting sued, they will just do the so-called standard of care therapy or standard of care diagnostic tests, because the insurance company wouldn't, even if you don't want to see the doctor, the insurance company wouldn't cover estrone sulfate and prolactin, because there's no need for it, there's no cause, and the doctor will usually not do them unless you're willing to pay for these yourself. And even then, many doctors are reluctant, because again, it exposes them to, like, let's say one of these things comes back abnormal, then they have to order additional tests and send you to specialists. And doctors are also aware currently very well of the risks of ordering invasive procedures, of overdiagnosis, of overtreatment. So they're trying to do a balance. So it will not be easy to convince your doctor to do these two tests, and that's why if you don't say anything, they will go with only estradiol. But estradiol, both in men and women, has almost no relevance to your total estrogenic load. In women, it does have some relevance, because you can calculate based on the cycle, based on the phase, whether it's the follicular or luteal, you can calculate approximately what is the level of the tissue estrogen, but it's still an estimate. It's based on studying menopausal women. Doesn't mean it applies to everybody. So again, back to the original statement, the estrogen sulfate and prolactin, if possible, done both together at the same time, are probably a much more reliable estimate of both total body load of estrogen and estrogenic activity, which is what really matters at the end.
I can't believe I had all that time and I couldn't find it. There was a paper by Litwack, 1985. It's like the regulation of prolactin by estrogen, and they like start the paper with like estrogen controls every conceivable route of prolactin administration. Yep. And then the one thing I will add is, like, I've been fortunate to see lots and lots of lab work, and I think if, again, maybe speaking to how medicine or treatment should be more of an art than a strict science in a way, sometimes the prolactin can be on the lower end, like 4 or even around there, and that wouldn't be necessarily high, but the person is having all these crazy, really intense symptoms. And so I would just throw that out there as, I know we've talked about this before, but you can measure things like your parathyroid hormone or your vitamin D or the serum phosphate, and those would help, I think, double check that maybe that was just an hourly thing and the prolactin was low, and then they ate a meal and went hypoglycemic and then it shot up, because prolactin can be, I think, a serum low baseline, but then it can spike really, really high, like in polycystic ovarian syndrome and things. So again, but yeah,
alkaline phosphatase is another great surrogate for estrogen. Estrogen tends to lower it. Parathyroid hormone is another great surrogate. Estrogen tends to raise it. Basically, the calcium to phosphorus ratio also helps. And especially if there's hypercalcemia, that's actually a great indication that the total estrogen signaling in the body is high, even though it may not show up on the test as a high prolactin. It usually does, but not always. But if your serum calcium is elevated, almost always that is due to an excess of estrogen signaling, because estrogen is what increases bone resorption. And in people with the so-called hypercalcemia of cancer, for a long time, it wasn't known what was causing the actual hypercalcemia of cancer, because not all people have metastasis in the bones. For the ones that do, then it's obvious because the cancer starts to dissolve the bone. But many of them don't. Yet they still get towards the later stages of the cancer, they get hypercalcemia. So it wasn't known for a long time what was causing it. So then they found out there is a peptide called PTHRP, parathyroid hormone related peptide, right? I think Ray spoke about it. It's produced mostly by cancer cells, but even that by itself couldn't explain the hypercalcemia. And recently they discovered that it's estrogen overproduced by cancer cells, which cancer cells almost universally overexpress aromatase, because it makes so much sense because of the fatty acid metabolism, and estrogen increases both the fat acid synthesis and the fat acid oxidation. So most cancer cells will overproduce estrogen, and it was the estrogen that was causing the increased bone resorption. So there are multiple different surrogates for estrogenic activity, and it's really a shame that doctors haven't made a use of them, and they do something as primitive, really primitive, as checking only one of the 3 isomers. And it's known that in neither women nor men, it's really a good indication of anything except gonadal function. So if you're a man and if your estradiol is lower than the normal range, there's usually some kind of an issue with the gonad. Same thing is with women. If there's below the range, then it's something with the ovaries, but not much beyond that, right? There are other biomarkers, and endocrinology is just starting to wake up to those.
Sweet, thank you. We'll bullet through these last handful of questions. Thoughts on dextrose? Cam says, thoughts on dextrose powder for athletes?
I don't think it has any ergogenic effect. I know it's a very, very widely used sugar, but I would actually use trehalose. In my experience, trehalose and fructose, actually they have a much more potent ergogenic effect. And actually, you don't even have to ingest it. You can just do a mouthwash with a sweet solution, and it has been shown that apparently there's some kind of receptors in the tongue that are connected directly to the brain. And as soon as you basically do a mouthwash with something sweet, but it has to be actual sugar. Artificial sweeteners in the studies did not work. So you just do a mouthwash with a sweetened liquid, and that immediately removed the so-called central fatigue, which has been shown to be due to serotonin. So just doing a mouthwash with a Gatorade should be enough to give you like a small temporary performance boost without even ingesting the Gatorade itself. So again, nothing wrong with dextrose. I don't think it's anything special in terms of performance enhancing.
Sweet. Edward Cornish says, to what extent can IQ be improved by study and environmental stimulation? Many psychologists say that it's almost purely genetic, but Ray Pete seems to think the opposite. What's your guys' take on this? Thank you.
I think we covered this in the previous podcast. Somebody asked specifically about IQ. It's so far the studies that have come out, all of the studies that claim it was genetic have been debunked, or at the very least, new data has come out that show that the group that they selected to do the genetic study on is really homogeneous. It's not representative of the entire population. Long story short, you can very easily become demented and retarded if you deprive yourself of 48 hours of sleep or your temperature drops below 95 degrees. Try it and you'll see. And basically you can improve, conversely, you can improve intelligence, and specifically IQ score, you can raise it by a few points by increasing ATP synthesis in the brain. There are several human studies showing that creatine, which buffers ATP, doesn't increase ATP, but it allows the body to draw from creatine as a reserve of ATP. It increases IQ by 5 to 7 points in adults, which is a really massive improvement, because the IQ scale is logarithmic. So raising the IQ by 5 to 7 points in a person, it's almost like doubling their intelligence for the next few hours. Thyroid does it as well. Progesterone does it. Pregnenolone is a great one. In general, your brain and your intelligence and consciousness cannot be separated. Anything that promotes one will promote the other. One of them is structure, the other one is function. And in general, things that promote consciousness, such as caffeine, pregnenolone, thyroid, etc., will allow you to be more intelligent as well. And it has been confirmed in multiple human trials. I'm not a believer in the genetic version of in the genetic explanation of intelligence. Just because something is heritable doesn't mean it's genetic. And now we're starting to hear more and more studies come out with these epigenetic explanations. But even those are heavily skewed. They're basically like a cop-out. They're just the genetic industry's tool of avoiding immediate defeat, or at least admitting defeat. But ultimately, none of the studies that came out with hard evidence for IQ being a genetically determined feature have so far stood the test of time or the test of scrutiny. They've all been either retracted or have been shown to be based on subsets of populations that are not representative of the entire population.
Sweet, thank you. And since I was muted last time, I'll just take this 5 seconds to say real fast. Consider subscribing if you're watching this and you're not subscribed already. All super chats donated to Mr. Raymond Pete, and we'll read them at the end. And we're nearing the end here, kind of guys. We do have a handful of questions, but if you do want to do a super chat and ask Georgi something, please, you probably want to do that pretty soon. And yeah, just subscribing to the channel, liking, and leaving a comment will enter you into our kind of every bi-weekly giveaway, and you have like a pretty substantial chance of winning. so I mean, relative. So you should try to do that.
And okay. By the time I reach, we do the giveaway with 30 products, and I guess everybody will win.
Everybody will win at that point. But yeah, and just I am so ecstatic at the comments, and just the feedback of this has just been incredible. I enjoy it more, and I think, Georgia, you've said similar things. So again, I sincerely appreciate everybody watching, and the comment. I've been keeping my eye on it, and it's pretty fantastic too. So thank you guys so much. Hopefully I don't accidentally mute myself this time. We'll just do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so back to questions. Ryan Heaney says, is very dry, cracking skin on the big toe indicative of a vitamin A deficiency? I seem to remember Ray saying this, but couldn't find the quote. Thanks. I'll take my answer off the air.
It could be, indicative of vitamin A deficiency, of zinc deficiency, copper or selenium deficiency. Sometimes it could be protein deficiency, depending on what kind of protein you're eating. In general, I've seen that usually increasing collagen intake, like basically gelatin, or eating just pure glycine, tends to correct any kind of skin abnormalities related to either overgrowth or cracking or in general rough skin that basically that many people dislike. So you can try the vitamin A. These deficiencies tend to happen mostly in the summer because then the requirement for vitamin A increases. Excuse me. So if it is vitamin A, it should be the improvement should be visible within the first two to 3 days. If it's something like zinc or selenium deficiency, it usually takes longer to see the effects of increasing intake from things like oyster or other seafoods. And then if it's protein deficiency or collagen deficiency, then eating just a spoon of gelatin for 2-3 days should also quickly correct it if that is the issue. Sometimes actually increased stress hormones, in my experience, can also cause cracking of the skin. So if none of these help, may not be a bad idea to do a test for cholesterol, vitamin D, and cortisol. Usually these three interplay in a very intricate way, and often I've seen people have problems with skin, especially cracking skin, but it was horizontal cracks instead of vertical ones. And in horizontal cracks, usually related to cortisol excess relative to the other protective hormones.
Yeah, sometimes like vitamin A is interesting because zinc affects it. Obviously, thyroid affects it. Protein affects it.
Vitamin D affects it.
Vitamin
right?
D, I was just going to say that.
Everything.
And so, like, I've noticed things that you might see on first glance, like dry skin somewhere, then you'd be like, oh, vitamin A, but was actually solved with zinc or vitamin D or something. So, and also eating too much liver actually made it worse. And so it, again, wrapped up in this whole metabolism-like thing. So, before I say the next question, very generous super chat from Steph again, $62.80. Thank you, Steph. Is incredible.
I need to buy her a beer. I've already asked her, so I'll take her out.
That's amazing. Thanks again, Steph. And thanks for being a fantastic moderator. Okay, Daniel says, Ray Pete frequently talked about the fact that the process of PUFA accumulation is still occurring with age while consuming only predominantly saturated fat sources like butter and coconut oil. Does this mean that PUFA depletion is only possible via a fat-free diet and/or that blocking lipolysis becomes more important the older the age of the individual? I think so.
I think basically the depletion of the PUFA depends primarily on two factors: how much PUFA you ingest, and what's the shape of how good of a shape your liver is in. Because the liver is the organ that's predominantly responsible for getting rid of the PUFA. You don't want to oxidize it, right? So whatever amount is available through baseline lipolysis, you want your liver to be in good enough health to be able to glucuronidate it and excrete it. So I think it is possible to deplete it. You don't have to go on a completely fat-free diet, but your excretion rate should exceed the ingestion rate, so to speak. And I don't know of a simple way to measure that. Maybe Ray does. But you should be able to do basic blood tests, and basically if you're excreting more PUFA than you are ingesting and or storing, the levels of meat acid should be rising over time, even if they're not over the limit, which would indicate the EFA deficiency. Over time, the body perceives the depletion of PUFA. It manifests itself through the gradual rising of the meat acid. So if your meat acid, it's a very sensitive biomarker and very specific for EFA depletion. So if your meat acid levels are rising over time, then you're probably on the right track and you're depleting yourself of PUFA.
Can you do? I'm sorry, I might have missed it. Can you do a simple blood test for meat acid?
Yeah, there is. Okay. Yeah, very simple one.
Yeah, I think this. Like you said, I think Ray is so extreme with it because it really does matter as you get older, So, yeah, didn't he say he's like 1.5 grams of PUFA or something ridiculous?
He said he now uses exclusively hydrogenated coconut oil, and somebody asked him why. Like, isn't regular coconut oil good enough for you? He's like, at my age, I need to worry about like every single gram of PUFA that's in my diet.
I'm hesitant to say this because he was kind of joking, but I was when I was talking to him, he was like, I like to be as extreme as possible, but it was in a jest, so I want to like really emphasize that. But I think he likes. I mean, I am speculating, but like doing this for a long time, you do notice certain things that really affect your function, and right. for somebody like him. who's just a extremely intelligent individual, like maybe he really notices a difference with 1 versus 2 versus 3 grams of PUFA. Like I don't know, but
well, it's also the age. I mean, basically, I'm guessing age does matter to a degree, and it makes you more susceptible to like a number of different things. So look, even a minor increase. I just saw a study today that the cat parasite Toxoplasma gondii, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it basically can get into your brain, and it's now thought to be responsible for about 5% of the cases of schizophrenia. So it's a parasite that lives in cats. It doesn't do any damage to the cat, but basically it can infect human hosts, and it only affects a subset of the population of humans. They didn't know why. And today they discovered that it chooses the human host based on the amount of linoleic acid in the blood. So the more linoleic acid you have, the more susceptible you are to infection by this really nasty parasite that once it gets into your brain, there is no getting out of it. There's no treatment. It just sits there and basically like kind of takes, hijacks your brain, and it's known to make rats completely berserk to the point where they ignore obvious cues in the environment, like smell of cat urine or cat litter, or even like cat sounds, and the rats completely lose any fear and walk straight towards the cat. It's almost like the cat developed this perfect. What I'm trying to basically describe is that this is a really like a very pernicious parasite capable of doing a lot of bad things to the brains of animals, and apparently it chooses its host. The vulnerability signature is how much PUFA there is in your blood. And I saw another study which showed that the meningitis bacteria causing bacterial meningitis apparently also chooses, not that it chooses, but your susceptibility to infection of your brain, of your meningeal pores there, of the meningeal opening. It chooses, again, your susceptibility to infection is also dependent on 2 things: elevated free fatty acids and the composition. The higher the unsaturation, they didn't do specifically linoleic acid, but the higher the unsaturation of the fatty acids in your blood, then the higher your susceptibility to bacterial infection of the brain. So these 2 things cannot be a coincidence. Two wildly different parasites are basically choosing and succeeding in infecting hosts that have a high degree of unsaturation of their lipids. So yeah.
Terrifying. Okay, Bushido1 says, I have been following a PD diet, high fruit, calcium, salt, gelatin, beef, low PUFA for close to 6 months. My temperatures are 97 Fahrenheit, prolactin is 12, TSH is 2, and my cholesterol is 145. Levels haven't improved much since I started. Some of my symptoms are getting worse, hair loss / mood. I already have a liver function test, and all the markers seemed okay apart from total cholesterol being too low at 145. Is there any other particular blood test that I could try to see why my temperatures aren't going up, even while eating a diet that should support my metabolism?
In my experience, if temperatures are not going up from a high carb, decent amount of protein meal, usually there's either excessive lipolysis or an infection somewhere. So a chronic low-grade endotoxemia can actually sometimes prevent temperatures from rising, and some people need like a much higher dose of thyroid to respond. So I don't know. I mean, Steph and I discussed a number of different tests, blood tests for endotoxin. None of them seem to be standard. They are available, but none of them seem to be standard. So I don't know how easy would it be to test for that. But usually, if there is a problem with endotoxin, the red blood cell count starts to rise. So it doesn't go too high, but it tends to be very close to the upper limit or slightly above. So that may be a decent surrogate. HDL is another decent surrogate for endotoxin. Doctors loved HDL, but it really is a biomarker of endotoxin. People who drink a lot of alcohol have high HDL, but it's high because it needs to transport the endotoxin back to the liver. So I would do these 2 tests. If they come back positive, then I think it's obvious that the endotoxemia needs to be addressed somehow, whether with antibiotics or eating more easily digestible food. And before, I would try a little bit of aspirin and niacinamide, see if that improves the temperatures, because those are the 2 main reasons that I know why temperatures wouldn't rise.
Sweet. Thank you. Helena Denley says, in the KMUD interview on weight loss, Ray mentions that you can get an idea of the metabolic rate by measuring fluid intake and output for a day
Right.
And that can that every 100 milliliters missing, evaporated out, equates to 1,000 calories burnt. Can you explain more about how this works?
It's actually every liter, 1 liter of fluid corresponds to 1,000 calories burned. So if you ingested, let's say, if you ingested 3 liters of fluid and you only peed out 1, basically that amounts to you burned 2,000 calories. And if you basically, if you drank 3 liters and peed out 2, then it means you only burned 1,000 calories. I don't know exactly what the mechanism is. Basically, I know that metabolism requires water, and the process of carbs, the digestion of carbs requires water as well. So the more intense the metabolism, I'm guessing the more water is required. So that's basically how it works. And usually, if you pee very often, that's an indication of high adrenaline. And it's also an indication of low blood osmolarity, of low blood volume. And the way the body tries to combat that is by making you excrete the extra water. So that's how it increases blood volume. So again, peeing too often is a sign of either too much water, too little salt, in general, low blood volume, and or high adrenaline. All of these things are correlated, and that's why you're peeing too much. So conversely, if you don't pee that much, then most of this water goes towards processing of the food that you've eaten.
Sweet, thank you. Tommy says, what are the safest antibiotics to experiment with without any lab tests? If you could include dosage and duration as well.
I mean, I think we've covered it so many times. I would say the penicillin family and the tetracycline family are probably the safest, or at least the most benign, with the least propensity for side effects.
And again, like, don't discount the mushrooms and the carrot and things like those can be powerful, but continue.
Yeah. So basically, so the penicillins, I think like 500 milligrams daily, a few times a week, should be enough to handle like a mild to moderate gut dysbiosis. Sometimes if there is a serious issue with bacterial overgrowth, you may need the full dosage, which for the penicillin types is usually about 1,500 milligrams daily for an adult, like 500 milligrams 3 to 4 times daily for about a week, and then you can fall back on like a maintenance dose of the 500 milligrams a few times weekly. For the tetracyclines, usually for bacterial issues in the colon, a tetracycline 100 to 150 to 200 milligrams is enough. For a more severe an actual infection, up to 800 milligrams may be needed. Doxycycline, the common dosage is 100 milligrams. I think that's plenty. And then I think Ray also likes the erythromycin and the clarithromycin antibiotics. I think those tend to vary, but like most of the time the dosage are like in the 250 to 500 milligrams daily. And then there's an antibiotic called neomycin, which is really great because you can actually sterilize the gut with even a single, like a once daily, a single dose once daily, and it's used to sterilize the colon for people undergoing elective abdominal surgery. Mm-hmm. So the protocol is you take 1 gram the day before surgery, and then you take 500 milligrams 8 hours before the surgery, and apparently that's enough to sterilize the colon for the next week or two while you're undergoing the surgery and recovering. Wow. Now, I think those are, like, the neomycin is a good antibiotic, but it tends to, like, its side effects are not pleasant. It tends to be nephrotoxic, kidney toxic in higher doses, and maybe that's why it's not used more often. But I know Ray likes it in lower doses, and I think 200 to 300 milligrams should be enough to have a beneficial effect on digestion.
Did you by chance see that Bird Antibiotics website?
Which one?
It's called, like, I should have wrote it down. It's like Flow something. It's like a bird antibiotic website, but they have
for birds?
It's for birds and animals, but it's like USP antibiotics. I know I'm going to get like 100 emails asking about this, so I didn't write it down. It was on the Ray P forum. I was just browsing, and somebody posted, but if you type in like bird antibiotics, you might find it. And again, I'm not endorsing this. I have no friggin' clue of like how good they are, but they did say that they're USP antibiotics and that they are for birds, but they could be for human consumption, and they were really expensive. So that was kind of the downside. So it'd probably be even
and I've seen usually for birds, because I was doing some research on the neomycin.
For fish too.
They usually combine
Fish Max or something.
Fishmax, yeah. They usually combine 1 or 2 antibiotics together, up to 3. So neomycin I've usually seen in combination with a penicillin or like a clarithromycin. I haven't seen it on its own when it comes to animal usage. I think it's used on its own mostly for humans.
It was. Let me just get this website up because I know many people are gonna ask me about it. Yeah, you make a good point too. Combining them sometimes can be even more noticeable than taking one at a time, and so that I think that is. I think there's like a mind virus that antibiotics are some of the most risky things you can use. But again, for what it's worth, they're some of the most useful things that I feel like I've ever used. And then I don't feel like I've ever harmed myself with them. Like
Right.
I couldn't tell you any really bad experience I've had with them. And so I think they really get a bad rap.
Yeah, relative to the side effects that they have, like their their benefit to cost ratio is really high. I hate to use that word, but like it's from anything that your doctor can give you, the antibiotics are probably one of the mildest things you can get, despite their bad reputation.
Okay, I can't find the exact website, so we're just gonna have to move on.
You'll deal with the deluge of emails later.
You guys will have to find it yourselves. Okay, where were we? We only have a few left. Mike Cerny says, dental x-rays, do you get them as part of an annual exam, but nutritionally protect yourself, or refuse if no problem?
I've tried refusing them, but no dentist that I've ever met basically is willing to do any dental work without the x-rays. So we've agreed, basically I've kind of extorted my dentist, and now she only does a very limited x-ray that only focuses on that tooth and just 2 or 3 around it. Like basically I've said no full mouth x-rays unless we really have a good reason for it, because by default they go for the whole mouth, right? It gives them like a great view of the nerves and everything else. But if they don't plan on doing, and the dentist should be able to see the teeth from the outside, it kind of tell you right off the bat whether really need the whole mouth x-ray or not. And many people do not. So if you can get away, if you can press your dentist to do only like a localized x-ray, I think that would be the way to go. But so far I haven't found any dentist that's willing to do any work without an x-ray of, at the very least of the tooth that's supposed to be worked on.
So I had visited a dentist probably over 5 or 10 years. The first time like relatively quickly after I moved to Mexico, and she was like, "Do you want x-rays?" And I was like, "No." And she was like, "Okay." And then
Wow.
That's the last
She asked
time
you?
we ever talked about it. And so I'm crazy, but again, I travel, so I'm sure I'm getting a heavy dose of x-rays even when I'm avoiding the machine. I bet just walking by the machine is bad, or just being around it, And then also, I think in the US or New York or whatever, they were showing, I don't know what company was using them, but they're like vans that have huge x-ray machines that are just for
scanning cars.
Security or
Department of
or
Homeland
something.
Security. They got sued.
Yeah. So who knows how many x-rays we're being exposed to? But if somebody did have like a really huge mouth dental work that they needed done, and they didn't want x-rays, I bet it would be relatively easy to get that done in Mexico, because my dentist couldn't have given a shit if I wanted them around. But also, one last story. I have a friend who's a like celebrity dentist in Beverly Hills, and we like grew up together and playing music. And I was like, "Hey, dude, I'm going to Mexico, but I'd love to get like dental checked before I leave." And he was like, "No way am I going to do anything to you without getting an x-ray."
Right.
And this was somebody I had known for years, and it was like, there's no way.
It's a liability thing, basically they want to know what's underneath. If there's like an abscess tooth or something like that, there's a protocol that you need to follow. It's not that he doesn't want to, but if he violates the protocol, even though you're the friend, that this exposes them to like action from the FDA, the local board that certifies them. It's really a nasty thing. You may be the most well-meaning person. If this work gets out that this person does like dental work without following the proper procedure, they can get in trouble even if you don't do anything. Like other people will.
Yeah, you could tell it's a liability thing.
Yeah.
Elliot says, Danny, Roddy, the grand solar minimum will make flights more dangerous. I don't know what that is, but I'm interested. Okay.
Yeah, the one that I posted that's going to cause the global cooling. Like I posted a study on the forum from a Russian scientist who said that the great solar minimum, like the electromagnetic field of the sun, will reach like an 11-year minimum, or actually a 100-year minimum over the next few years or something. And they predicted when that happens, basically the overall climate of the Earth will cool off. So that may be it's another explanation of why there may be an ice age instead of like a global warming.
Okay, only two more questions. Dan says, wanted to ask about the temples and edges of the forehead closer to the eyebrow seem to be slower to regrow hair, or did Danny have a different experience? On a positive note, this Ray Pete forum user, Raw Meat, seemed to regrow his prepubertal hairline. In a different post a few down, he summarized his approach, and it's basically what Danny/Georgi/Pete have written. Interestingly, he mentions aspirin, and the other guy who claims to have regrown his hair on the thread took lots of coffee and aspirin. I'm convinced it's a brain thing, and actually my friend, who I wish would sometimes join us, his name's Nicholas Simpson. He's a genius, but he forwarded me a paper 2019 about white matter in hyper intensities. So like white matter lesions being more prevalent in people with so-called androgenic alopecia. And this again backs up that speculative video I made, but it also connects it to hypertension, because the cerebral atrophy in hypertension is just not controversial at all. And so again, I think there's lots of, and also like anti-prolactin drugs treat hypertension, so I'm not trying to say this is simple or anything, but just the hair is being interconnected with the brain. And again, I'm not saying people that have less hair are stupid, like I think that's the thing that gets bite-sized thing talked about on the internet. I think it's just how the system is handling itself.
It was the least dangerous maladaptation that the system could come up with, like given that there was an issue with metabolism.
Yeah. And so that hyper intensities thing is ridiculously interesting to me. I've been reading about it for the last few days, but even it happens in Alzheimer's and things. And so I don't know if you could ever say that hair loss was more prevalent in Alzheimer's, just because it's more prevalent in older people and you tend to be on the older side when you get Alzheimer's. Yep. But I did find a paper, its relation to iron. And I think like in the white matter hyper intensities, the lesions were like filled with iron. And, and so again, I'm just beginning to look into this, but it is interesting.
Well, look, now that we're getting I'm sure you've seen the post that the millennials and the younger generation are getting sicker and sicker. I made a post that said the young have now become the old. So if we're getting the so-called early onset Alzheimer's in people in their like late 30s and even 40s, those would be great people to study, great to see basically if this confirms the theory or not. Because they shouldn't be, many of them, some of them may be losing their hair, but they should be losing less hair than 80-year-olds, which used to be the average age of diagnosis for Alzheimer.
I would put money on younger kids experiencing hair loss sooner just by browsing those hair loss talk and hair loss help forums. It will be like, I'm 17 and losing hair, or I'm 16. Yep. And then also there was an article in like the Indian Times. It's like an older article, but it specifies that the Indian men were losing hair younger and younger. And the like very simple article talks about it being due to stress. Yeah. And so it's just like, but again, thanks to Nick for sending me that paper, because it's the first article I'm aware of really connecting the brain to so-called androgenic alopecia, but
to external signs of brain dysfunction, basically.
Yeah. And again, those white matter hyper intensities or whatever are just like things that happen in aging. And so again, it just
So just like Parkinson, remember somebody asked Ray what Parkinson is, and he said it's basically a form of accelerated aging of the brain. Mm-hmm. That's just how it manifests. Mm-hmm. And I guess the same thing could be said about so I guess, since you can draw a line between like disease and aging, mm-hmm. they're kind of like the same thing. One of them is just a more accelerated version of the latter. This should be no different, right? It's just I guess it's a more localized and probably affects the brain more than the rest of the body. It's just a dysfunction of the brain will tend to affect the eyes and the hair first. And I think hearing as well. People with androgenic alopecia actually tend to have a much higher incidence of something called Meniere syndrome.
Uh-huh.
And Meniere syndrome is a disease of the inner ear, and the inner ear is part of the brain. So that maybe is something you want to look at. There is a connection there.
I didn't know that. Ray talked about the crease of the ear being, I think that's also a heart disease.
Heart disease. So if you have like a deep crease of your ear, that's a very reliable predictor of future heart attack or like a stroke or something like that.
That's really interesting.
Earlobe creases, yeah.
And just to answer this personal question, I don't know, but I speculate that it's something with the cerebral cortex of why, or again, the entire cerebral cortex, but perhaps maybe the frontal lobes because they're sensitive to stress, and maybe the temperature and the reinforcement of the hair growth and things on that end affect the temples or whatever, but just the cerebral cortex in general. But I don't know, Okay. Bob says, last question, any advice on improving cognitive functions, memory, concentration? We kind of went through this, but
methylene blue is a great one and probably one of the safest you can try. Basically it's now used as a nootropic in the blogosphere. If you type methylene blue nootropic, you'll see a number of different protocols with it. They're usually in the microgram range. I personally find like the best effects for methylene blue at a single daily dose of about 1 milligram. Ray also seems to prefer it in the microgram range as well. He says that it mimics thyroid function in those dosages. Of course, thyroid works great. Caffeine is a known nootropic, and it seems to work much better when combined with either theanine, which is an amino acid, or inosine. So a combination of caffeine and inosine may actually be a great nootropic because inosine is a reverse precursor of ATP through like a backfill pathway, a salvage pathway. And when taken with caffeine, basically caffeine prevents the inosine from turning into uric acid. And then the only two pathways that inosine can go into are either ATP or uric acid. If you block the uric acid, it has to go into the ATP pathway. And it's just as I said earlier, anything that raises ATP in the brain has a known powerful nootropic effect and is shown to even raise temporarily IQ scores, which is really hard to do because, I shouldn't say really hard to, but it was thought to be entirely genetic and unmovable. And raising ATP in the brain, the human studies use creatine, but they explain that a mechanism of action is elevated ATP, or at least buffering ATP when there is a greater demand for the ATP. So in my experience, my prediction would be another way to do it would be a combination of caffeine and inosine, and or trying methylene blue on its own.
Sweet. Okay, we'll rifle through these super chats. Thank you, Georgi, so much. We didn't really talk about it, but Georgi is just here because he's such a gracious guy, and nothing is being exchanged here. And so this is mutually beneficial to both of us, and I would not want to talk to anybody else. So, Georgi, thank you so much for just being a good friend and just a great partner in doing these, and I sincerely appreciate it. Just making this show excellent.
Thanks, man. Likewise.
Okay, so Shaman Frontal says, "Oh, Divine Superconductor TV." Matt Blackburn just gave us a super chat. Everybody check out his stuff. Great dude. Sorry, lost tension here. Shaman Frontal says, "How to grow a bigger pencil?" And assuming he means penis.
It's tied to androgenic activity. And actually, in several countries around the world, dihydrotestosterone is approved as a treatment for micropenis. And I emphasize micropenis is because so far the studies that we have show that you can increase the length of the penis by applying androgens on it, but only if it's underdeveloped to start with. The evidence is much sparser in regards to whether you can have a normally developed penis and then increase the length even further by applying androgens on it. The animal studies seem to show that it is possible, at least the studies in rats and primates. And given that we're fairly close to primates, there is no reason to believe that the same thing wouldn't be achievable in humans as well. So if you can get on dihydrotestosterone, testosterone gel should also work. And in fact, in some countries, testosterone gel is the only approved treatment for micropenis because dihydrotestosterone has a bad rep. It's basically said to cause baldness and prostate problems, so they don't want to use it even in children, even in younger people. So testosterone should work because the skin of the penis has a high expression of the enzyme 5-alpha reductase. So when you apply the testosterone on it, a good portion of it will convert to dihydrotestosterone. And if getting these prescription gels is not an option, other over-the-counter remedies may work as well, especially DHEA and or androsterone, both of which are reliable precursors to dihydrotestosterone, especially when applied topically. So I would use basically if DHT is being used, I would use a dosage that allows for 5 milligrams to be absorbed into the skin of the penis. Now, how much needs to be applied depends on the absorption rate of the product. Most of the commercial ones are designed or at least assume an absorption rate of 10%. So you would need a dosage. You need to apply a dosage of at least 10 times higher to get effectively 5 milligrams absorbed. For testosterone, the studies that I've seen basically said anywhere between 5 and 10 milligrams absorbed. So that means if it's a 10%, that means between 50 and 100 milligrams application of any kind of a cream or gel that's commercially available. I think the most common one is androgel. And then for DHEA and androsterone, I would be careful with a DHEA because even though not all of the absorption through the skin is, of course, not 100%, you don't want it to convert into estrogen because it can do so pretty easily. So if DHEA is being used, I wouldn't use topically more than 15 milligrams just as a total dosage, even if only 10% absorbs. It's just too much risk of converting into estrogen, and estrogen clearly will not increase the length of the penis. And if androsterone is used, you can probably use any dose you want. Androsterone was part of a cholesterol-lowering drug back in the 60s and 70s. It was called Atromid. And the daily dosages, first, it used to be given by injection, and they were giving 50 milligrams per day, 50. That's pretty high. When Ray was asked about androsterone, many times he basically said he either wouldn't use it, or if he does, he would use no more than 1 to 2 milligrams daily. So if 50 milligrams were used back in the day without any side effects, and it was lowering cholesterol, was doing a lot of other good benefits, you can probably use that much topically on the penis. And assuming, again, 10% absorption, you'll give you about 5% androsterone absorbed. And of that, about 60% converts into DHT. So you should be able to get a few milligrams of DHT localized there too. And another good way to keep things systemically going is the higher your thyroid function, the more you're shifting the metabolism of the androgens towards the 5-alpha reductase-derived ones. So T3 is known to increase the ratio of androsterone to ethylcolanolone, and that's one of the most reliable biomarkers of total body androgenicity. So keeping metabolism high is very, very androgenic. It's not a coincidence that people with high metabolism tend to be well endowed.
Okay, thank you. Shman Frontal has 2 other questions. They say, best approach to sterilizing the gut. We talked about this really well before, but they say rifaximin, and we've also talked about the last one, but do you want to just give a real quick answer?
Yeah, rifaximin is fine, but it tends to work best in cases of SIBO. Actually, it was developed for that specific indication in mind. It's an antibiotic that doesn't absorb very well into the blood, so it tends to work mostly in the intestine. So you can try rifaximin, but in my experience and based on the published studies, if you have an overgrowth with some kind of a Clostridia species in the colon, rifaximin tends to not work very well. And usually for cases like that, the penicillin antibiotics or the neomycin or the clarithromycin/azithromycin, those tend to work better. And we already discussed dosages, so maybe they can look at the recording and see.
Okay, they have one last question. And thank you so much. These is 2 pounds, 2 pounds, and 5 pounds, I think. I'm an idiot. I don't know. I think the euros, maybe 5 euros. I don't know. Okay, a friend has TSH of 0.9, free T3 of 3.8, and a free T4 of 1.6, but has all the symptoms of hypothyroidism and low immunoglobulins A. How is it possible? What can he do about it? He is skinny.
TSH is not a very good metric of your peripheral thyroid metabolism and or function. TSH can be lowered by many things. If you take basically if you drink a 200 milligram dosage of caffeine, it will plummet your TSH, but it will not necessarily make you hyperthyroid. Another thing is that basically you can have these numbers, but reverse T3 could also be high. I don't think that has been measured. And again, ultimately, the way you measure thyroid function is ideally by pulse temperature and Achilles tendon reflex relaxation. Those are the functional measures of how well your metabolism really works. TSH is not reliable, and there could be a number of different issues. Could be an issue with pituitary, could be a cross contamination on the tests, depending on whether you're taking a supplement such as biotin.
High adrenaline.
Yeah, high adrenaline. Biotin is known to interfere with a number of these different tests. It can come back, your TSH can come back as too low or too high. There have been already published cases of people taking high-dose biotin for multiple sclerosis and then their thyroid tests coming back completely out of whack. Cortisol is also known to temporarily lower TSH, but at the same time it competes with thyroid hormone for binding to the receptor. So you can have low TSH and still be functionally very hypothyroid. A great example are people with Cushing syndrome. Their TSH tends to be low, yet they're clearly hypometabolic given the rapid weight gain and central obesity that they develop. I would repeat those tests and test reverse T3. And if temperature and pulse are low, then I think this calls for maybe supplementing with thyroid regardless of the normal tests.
Great stuff. Sue Escobar for $20. Thank you so much, Sue. She says, I've learned so much from Ray, and after circling around various diets, Ray's approach makes the most sense to me. I still have loads to learn, and I'm excited about that. Thanks, Danny and Georgie, for these shows. Thank you for watching, Sue.
Thank you. So the question was? There is no question.
No question. Just
excellent.
Very generous, Sue. Thank you for that. Ellie says, Danny, your hair is making you look like Dr. Pete. I hope that's a good thing. Chuck says for $5. Oh man, I'm so done with these currencies. I don't even I'm like $5 something. Thank you, Chuck. He says, Danny says the cure for hair loss is definitely quit your job and move to Hawaii. That's what I heard. Hate it is the hero that Gotham needs. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you. Yeah, if you can quit your job and move to Hawaii, then invite us over there.
Well, that like I think I'm constantly confronted with like that solving hair loss problems is like this straightforward thing. And I think you'd probably agree. It's like the things needed to shift the balance, like your friend who went to 12,000 feet or whatever, it could be kind of an extraordinary effort, and not everybody can put like an unorthodox method to the test, and I like the spirulactone or whatever things because they show how powerfully protective progesterone and things like that can be. But again, I'm constantly getting these types of questions, and I don't even know if you had any specific thoughts on it.
I don't think any specific single measure would resolve it. All of the things that are pro-metabolic will probably give you like a specific, partial or minor or temporary benefit. But ultimately, there's a reason for this hair loss to be there and to continue to be there. And until that reason is removed, I don't think you should be hoping for some kind of a miracle solution. And even though my life is so much less stressful than it used to be, I'm still nowhere near the position where I was stress-wise when I first started losing my hair. So I basically have to quit my job and go back to the college lifestyle to be at the point where I can start expecting, okay, so my stress is basically at the level of a college student, which in this country isn't much for most people, right? You go to college mostly to have fun. Then when I can expect to have my hair like regrow more permanently. And even with the current amount of stress that I have, around the middle of July, like towards the end of July, I will have an almost full head of hair, which to me is perfectly fine because it shows me that this thing works. And then I start gradually receding it again. And then the worst is in December and January, which is metabolism happens to be at the lowest. So everything matches perfectly what I've seen, what I've read, and what Pete is saying. It's a matter of to what degree I can control it. And given my current lifestyle, there are other people that depend on me, and there are many different things in your life that it's not just you, right? So if it were just you, just like that Italian guy, you pick up and you go to Tian Shan Mountains or whatever your favorite place is, and you don't worry about civilization, don't worry about anything. He also happens to be fairly well off, doesn't have family. He only has I think he, up until a few years ago, only his mom was alive, and now she passed too. So he's by himself. He has nothing, nobody to report to, nothing to worry about, except doing the things that he likes. I mean, that's kind of like it's the childhood lifestyle, right? I don't know how many of us can afford to be in that situation.
Well, I've said it. If I had the things to do that you have to do, I would be dead. Like a family, a real job, like that stuff. And also, I know Chuck says it was a joke, but it actually triggered something. Like I get this question so often that I did want to talk about it, and you can't negate like how a person developed over time. Like I identify so strongly with Ray's work because I was like so critical of, I still am, but like to a way lesser degree, of myself. Like I was the authoritarian in my own head, like this vicious cycle of stress, And so again, I want to emphasize how complex everything is. And just because you drink milk and drink orange juice, it doesn't like negate 20 plus or 30 plus years of your life in developmental history of how you respond to stress. And so again,
it doesn't negate the toxic environment we continue to face, which Ray writes about every single day. So if that environment wasn't there, I think most of his work wouldn't even exist. Yeah. I think most of his work is about how environment is killing us and how it's not getting better, and how we need to make a concerted effort as a group, as mankind, to really change it, because that's such a fundamental, pervasive effect on everything we do, on every aspect of health.
Exactly. And I could keep dwelling on this, but like even in where I live in Mexico is pretty ritzy relative to other places. There are tons of cell phone towers here. And like the cell phone tower near my place is like I could see it, And again, just speaking to the bad environment, but again, it's
we're doing the best we can with the environment that we have. And, under that circumstances, you can have an optimal existence. If you believe you can avoid it all and stressing over every single little aspect of your lifestyle, then you can't. Then you're going to drive yourself crazy, right?
I want to throw in one last thing. I think it's absurd to think, okay, so like I'm like progressing a view of hair loss. So if I lose all my hair, that's like a problem, Like as far as I know, you're not doing that. You're an interested researcher. So I think it would be the onus would be on me, and that would be more probably from my point of view or how I'm portraying things. But I think it's ridiculous that like that paper that I mentioned about the androgenic alopecia hyper intensities, like, do I give a shit what that guy's hair looks like who wrote the paper? Like, absolutely not. Like, good information is good information. And so, like, I couldn't care about any of the hair loss researchers, what their hair looked like. Is the information good? Does it help me understand how the system is working? It's like, it's so, maybe it's like YouTube health space, but it's like really mind numbing to kind of take that point of view of like, oh, to trust this person's information, I need to see like the state of their hair. It's like totally ridiculous.
Well, it comes down to the whole alpha male mentality, which it's transferred even in marketing, and and I guess we're perceived as thought leaders, right? And as a thought leader, you have to defend your turf, and the way you defend your turf is you gotta look the way you're supposed to be looking, and you have to behave the way you're supposed to be looking. But look at, God forbid, look at what happens to a number of what happened over the last year to a number of these different health gurus. Many of them died of heart attack, or even if they didn't die, they had a heart attack. And many of them were proponents of this really extremely stressful lifestyle, whether it's CrossFit or it's like these extended fasts and whatnot. And I'm not saying that it can happen to anybody, but in general, I think there is a push, especially in the online community, in the blogosphere, is that if you are for a specific idea, you kind of have to look it, feel it, eat it, sleep it. You have to become it. And if you're not, then basically this is considered like a bad thing. Like if you have any doubts about about this idea that you're promoting, then you shouldn't really be trusted. And my take is, no, that's exactly the person that I'm going to trust, because remember, we started the podcast with this. Ideally, a healthy person is always confused until they find the right answer under the right circumstances. A person who always appears to be knowing things and knows always the right thing to say, then I don't know. I'll be kind of suspicious of that person. Either they're gaming me, or like they're like it's a psyop, or it's just not normal. A normal person should not be always in control and always appearing to always have the right answers. That's just not normal.
Well said. Okay, back to this. Okay, thanks for that, Chuck. DBO514, thank you so much, sir. $5. Are restless leg syndrome / bruxism symptoms of a serotonergic state? SSRIs have been known to induce bruxism. Can such a state be inherited?
Yes, there are a great sign / symptom, first and foremost, of intestinal irritation, and intestinal irritation correlates highly with a serotonergic dominance. So if you're not on SSRIs and you have restless leg syndrome or bruxism, chances are there's an intestinal inflammation and or / dysbiosis, SIBO, whatever you want to call it, but there's basically bacterial overgrowth and too much endotoxin and nitric oxide. If you are on SSRIs, then you better get off of them as quickly as possible. There are other non-serotonergic drugs that are approved as antidepressants. Thioneptine, mianserin, mirtazapine are two that come to mind. And in terms of inheritance, yes, it can be inherited. Just because something is inherited doesn't mean it's genetic. Multiple studies have come out recently showing that basically the children of obese fathers are much more likely to be obese as well. The children of fathers with type 2 diabetes are much more likely to develop it as well. The children of both parents, either one of them having depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or bipolar disorder, they're much more likely to develop it as well. But all of these things, think of it as just sort of like a guideline. It's not set in stone. It's just something that happened to one of your parents or your grandparents, or up to, like, I think 14 generations is the maximum that I've seen in animal studies. These epigenetic signals being transferred. Something happened along those 14 generations before you, and they passed this information further on. And it doesn't mean it cannot be changed. The more recently it happened, the stronger the signal is. But as multiple studies showed, just as maladaptation can be transferred to offspring, so can adaptation, which is proper. In other words, reversal of the pathology. So it can actually go both ways, and it does go both ways. So just because your parents had restless legs or bruxism doesn't mean you're doomed to have it. And knowing that it's tied to serotonin excess and or intestinal inflammation, now there's specific things that can be done to reverse it. And you will pass that reversal to your children as well.
Okay, only a few left. Steph for her $62.80. Thank you so much, Steph. Send that straight to Ray. Thank you so much. Brandon Treen for $4.99. Thank you so much, Brandon. He says, what are a few steps you'd suggest to correct insulin resistance in order to increase carb sugar content without experiencing hyperglycemia?
In my experience, insulin resistance is almost entirely driven by cortisol and adrenaline. So one of the most reliable ways that I've seen recently, as I mentioned, these experiments we're doing with people with progesterone and DHEA, is basically like a combination of DHEA and progesterone and DHEA. So 50 milligrams progesterone, 5 milligrams DHEA, repeated 2 to 3 times daily. One of the people who is doing this regimen is a type 2 diabetic, and now his blood sugar is back to normal. It's below 100. So to the point that a doctor is saying that something was off initially, because when your blood sugar drops from the 200s to below 100, that's a drop that a doctor doesn't believe. So now they're questioning the initial diagnosis, whether it was correct. So What can you do? I mean, initially, just to improve the overall insulin sensitivity, even something as niacinamide and aspirin would probably help. Human studies have shown that you can entirely reverse the insulin resistance with very high dosage of aspirin. 90 milligrams per kilogram was the human dose. That means that for a person weighing 100 kilos, that's 9 grams of aspirin daily. That's a lot. But these are drastic measures. You can improve it by using a lot less and using niacinamide and progesterone and vitamin E. In other words, anything that inhibits excessive lipolysis. But for full reversal, if you really want to go down that route, pharmacological cortisol blockers are known to fully reverse it. I mentioned that clinical trial with RU486 in men with type 2 diabetes, completely reversed it. So progesterone is the most potent endogenous cortisol antagonist. DHA is another one, so hence my suggestion of using the combination of these two to actually fully reverse it. And then if it's not that severe, then even the low dose aspirin and or niacinamide should be able to take care of it.
Sweet. Thank you so much for that, Brandon. Why Not says, any thoughts on studies saying sperm quality is best when ejaculating daily/near daily?
It may be, but I think it also depends on the hormonal status as well. Somebody whose testosterone is not high enough, it's not optimally high, basically every ejaculation brings testosterone lower and also increases prolactin. Neither one of these is good for sperm motility. So if your testosterone is below 500, I would recommend against frequent ejaculation. And then basically things that can improve it has been shown, not many people know, but pregnenolone was actually used as a male infertility drug in the earlier 20th century. It was used as a male fertility drug even before it was used for rheumatoid arthritis. So it was known as the male fertility drug for several decades, between 1910 and 1940. Only then the clinical trials with rheumatoid and osteoarthritis started. So pregnenolone can increase sperm motility, so can progesterone. And basically, if testosterone is low, I would not force the ejaculation. Testosterone is optimal, then I don't think it would hurt. I don't think there is anything special about frequent ejaculation that improves sperm motility. I think either extreme is probably not good enough, because ultimately too frequent, you trigger prolactin too often, and too infrequent, I think that's when you actually start increasing the sperm abnormalities. And how frequent is optimal? Nobody knows the exact formula, but the ancient Chinese martial artist practitioners had a formula. You take your age, you subtract 7, and you divide by 4. So that's the optimal daily period of it between two ejaculations. So just to make this simple, if you're, let's say, 28, you basically remove 7, that's 21. Well, it's not divisible by 4, so let's do 27. Okay, so 27 subtract 7, that's 20. Divided by 4, that's 5. So for a 27-year-old person, the optimal ejaculatory period, as far as sperm motility is concerned, is every 5 days, once every 5 days.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Why Not? Divine Superconductor TV, aka Matt Blackburn, for 99 cents. Thank you so much. Corey P for $5 says, love these discussions. I would like your take on canker sores, and if you know what a good dose of K2 for children would be. Thank you both.
K2 for children, I think usually any dosage would work. Unlike K1, I don't think K2 has the risks of excessive clotting somehow. It's known to stabilize the clotting system, so basically you'll prevent excessive bleeding, but it has been shown that in human studies that even several hundred milligrams daily doesn't result in an increased clotting. So for a child, I would probably do like a 1 milligram a day should be enough, depending on how old the child is. Up to 5 you're probably not going to raise any eyebrows. Keep in mind that when a child is born in a U.S. hospital, they usually get an injection with 5 milligrams of K1, and that's a massive dose. And it's K1, which its primary function is coagulation. So if that much is safe for a newborn, then you can probably go with up to 5 milligrams of MK4 for a child like under the age of 18. And as far as canker sores, they're universally tied to stress. So in my experience, like using a little bit of progesterone and internally, in other words, ingesting the progesterone tends to resolve them pretty quickly. And if that doesn't work, basically doing a mouthwash with methylene blue has also been shown to help. Not shown, but I've personally noticed that it helps a lot.
Somebody asked me this in email one time, and I found quite a bit of information on zinc deficiency causing it too. So you might want to.
The zinc deficiency is correlated with the viral increase, right? That's why they're recommending zinc for herpes and like for flu now, because the zinc deactivates the viruses. So, but ultimately, in order for the viruses to be reactivated, the zinc deficiency may be the direct thing enabling them to be that way, but it still comes down to suppressed immune system. So either high estrogen or high cortisol suppressing the immune system and reactivating those viruses that are living endogenously. I think canker sores is caused by an endogenous virus.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Thank you so much, Corey. Drew F. for $5.50. Thank you so much, Drew. Good to see you. Divine Superconductor TV for $9.99. Thank you so much, Matt. He says, what are your thoughts on microdosing LSD to lower serotonin?
I think it's a great tool. I don't know how much we're allowed to say on air in regards to a controlled substance. If you look at the human studies, there have been a lot of human studies with microdosing LSD over the last 5 years, and every single trial that I've seen so far has been wildly successful. They've used it for terminally ill people to cure depression. They've used it for basically prisoners to reduce recidivism after these people basically leave prison. They've used it for suicidal depression among basically young people, especially people coming back from war, from a conflict. Not necessarily PTSD, but suicidally depressed. They've used it for recently. They've used it actually to improve insulin sensitivity. And the reason this trial was done is because bromocriptine, which is an LSD derivative, was approved as a treatment for type 2 diabetes back in 2009. So they wanted to see if this effect is something unique to bromocriptine or it can be extended in general to all of the other ergot derivatives. So they did a recent clinical trial with microdosing LSD. I think they used only 20 micrograms or something like that. And then it also worked. So it shows that it's something about the anti-serotonin pro-dopamine effect that's very beneficial for diabetes. So I think it's a great way. But a less illegal option would be something like cyproheptadine and actually famotidine. Recent study came out, a case study, a person with full-blown serotonin syndrome. Basically, they gave this person famotidine, which is an anti-acid drug, and it completely stopped the serotonin syndrome like in its tracks. And that's usually the only drug that's known to do that, and it's used clinically for already ongoing serotonin syndrome is cyproheptadine. But famotidine was able to do that, and when I dug deeper, I found studies that go back to the 1970s showing that histamine 2 antagonists are capable of dramatically decreasing serotonin turnover in the entire body. In other words, somehow they block serotonin synthesis through an unknown mechanism. And of all the H2, all of the histamine 2 antagonists, all of the anti-acid drugs, the safest one is famotidine. It's the only one that doesn't have either an anti-androgenic effect or raises prolactin or increases susceptibility to pneumonia and viral infections, etc., etc. Famotidine is the only one that I trust of those drugs, and it's available over counter. And the dosage used to stop the serotonin syndrome was 20 milligrams. That's even below what a doctor would prescribe you to treat acid reflux. You can buy it dirt cheap from any grocery store in the States.
Sorry, there's a thing on my screen blocking me reading from this question, so I have to put it into text edit. You guys are trying to kill Georgi by keeping asking questions into the night here, but here we go.
I need to turn on the lights.
Yeah. And if I were in a country where it were legal to take LSD, it's one of the things I always wanted to use more, because honestly, talking about vitamin E and thyroid, those things pale in comparison. They're not even at the same level of actual LSD. But again, I don't know. I don't know what it's like to use it every day in small amounts. But okay, so this is the last question from Brandon Treen. Again, thank you so much, Brandon, for $9.99. Thank you guys so much. He says, what might you suggest to reduce postprandial tachycardia or a positional tachycardia. Wake up in the middle of the night, but curious what you awesome cats might suggest. Thanks for all you both do. Thanks for that.
Yeah, in my experience, it's typically related to underproduction of gastric acid, and I know people who manage to improve there simply by taking a tablet of aspirin with their meal. I don't know through what mechanism it works. I mean, I know aspirin is an acid, but it's not that acidic, but it's somehow it improved it, and they no longer get the tachycardia. I also know another person who used to have it. It wasn't just postprandial; they would get it randomly throughout the day. And in their case, using the amino acid taurine, which is known to optimize the electrolyte balance, that also resolved it. So it really depends on the actual cause. But these are the two cases that I'm aware of where aspirin and taurine helped. So those are the things I would try first.
Cool, brother. That is it. Let people know what you have going on, where they can find you, whatever.
They saw the blog, kdo.me. That's where I post my stuff. You already mentioned the Idea Labs supplement store, and I also continue posting on the Repeat forum. So those will be the places to find me, and of course the show if you keep inviting me.
Yes. Guys, thank you so much. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for the Patreon questions. Thank you for, we have like 73 people still watching. And so again, thank you guys so much. Seriously, appreciate it. Again, like the live stream and leave a comment and subscribe to be entered into Georgi's very gracious Idea Labs 4 products. So again, amazing. Thank you guys so much. These are so fun to do. We will be back on the 26th of July. Thank you again to Steph, amazing moderator. And Georgi, any last parting words?
Not really. Just keep watching. And, for those who are, when I first got into the Piterian environment, I felt overwhelmed. I think you had a show which said organizing the panic.
Oh, yeah.
I was panicking about first, there's so much information. How can I get it? How could I got it so wrong? And all of these things that are around me turn out to be designed to kill me. Many of these things are true, but the good news is that we do have the tools to reverse this. And I think the tide societally and systemically is changing, which to me is the most hopeful message, because up until 2 years ago, if you asked me, I would have been very nihilistic. I would have said that basically, and I think Pete kind of shared the same sentiment. Somebody asked him like, so what do we do? Like what, don't you think the world is ending? And he kind of said like, well, if civilization doesn't descend into like disease and tyranny, I think we as mankind may have an opportunity to do some like useful, fun things, kind of along those lines. I felt the same way about 2 years ago, but my mood has dramatically changed over the last 2 years, because now I'm seeing even bastions of dogma like Harvard University. They came out and basically flat out said, well, brain cancer specifically, but they said brain cancer is a metabolic disease. So, now that we have big money working on all of these things, hopefully many of the most horrible diseases will soon be a history. But it's just a matter of keep exerting pressure. Keep spreading the message. I think that's partially what's driving the powers that be to change the course, simply because now enough people are clamoring and saying, what you're giving us is not working, what you're giving us is killing us, we want something else. So I would like to think that we are part of that reason.
Straight from the source, you heard it here first. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you on the 26th. Have a great Friday evening. Love you guys all, and take care. Bye, guys.
Peace.